Chapter 1646. Everyone returned to the Mountain of the Way. As for why Qin Hao became the Sword Sovereign and occupied the South Sky Peak, it was because of the ley lines. The ley lines of the South Sky Peak were vast and boundless, like thousands of ancient tree roots spreading out, propping up the entire southern border of the East Continent. The earth chi of the entire southern border rushed to the bottom of the South Sky Peak. That was the center of the land, and it was a rare ley line of 5 spirits. The ley lines of 5 spirits were said to be the heart of the earth. It was extremely precious. Cultivating with the ley lines of 5 spirits would be of great help to warriors. Qin Hao had not reached perfection yet. Absorbing the earth chi to cultivate could greatly shorten the time needed to break through. Of course, he had to make good use of this treasure peak. But he didn't absorb the earth chi of 5 spirits for this purpose. If he only wanted to speed up his cultivation, he could have reached perfection half a year ago and become a great emperor. After all, Qin Hao's cultivation in his previous life was flawless. Although his emperor body was destroyed and his cultivation regressed, his emperor spirit remained at its peak. As he stepped into the emperor realm, his emperor spirit and physical body merged faster, and his comprehension of the way came naturally. This was also the reason why his improvement was faster than Xiao Han and Showuk. Because there were no obstacles in his breakthrough of rules and way. Muri was once puzzled by this. However, with the unfortunate departure of senior sister, Qin Hao was under great pressure, and it also made him see through a lot. If it was only for speed, so what if he reached perfection in 1 year? He was just following the same path from his previous life, and this path could not bring him new breakthroughs. If he wanted to surpass his previous life and himself, he needed to take a completely different path. He needed to put aside the accumulation of his previous life and return to the orthodoxy of the Divine Palace. In other words, he needed to constantly temper his emperor will and strengthen his rules, just like when he was cultivating in the Divine Palace. The ley lines of 5 spirits contained in the ley lines of the South Sky Peak just met the standard. It could temper his way and force out the limits of his potential. Like the divine monk Hui Tong, who had walked the difficult path with a flawless way. In the past 2 years, he had disguised himself as an alchemist and guarded the Garden. On the other hand, he had occupied the South Sky Peak as the Sword Sovereign and used the earth chi of 5 spirits to temper his emperor way. Now, his cultivation had reached the 6th tier of way. If it weren't for the fact that my emperor body is made up of 10,000 spirits and is a half-god, perhaps I would have missed out on this precious land. Qin Hao followed the group back to the Dao Mountain and rejoiced in his heart. The 5 spiritual earth vein was hard to find in the world. Ordinary people could not see through it. At least in his previous life, when he looked down on the East Continent, he did not find the 5 spiritual earth vein on South Sky Peak. Now that he had returned to Dao Mountain, there was a Dharma idol guarding it. The Dao wills of the two were interlinked, and their techniques flowed together. Qin Hao was not worried about the group of Shuiyao fairies. With their cultivation levels, it was impossible for them to break through the Dharma idol's sword formation. Zhenhua, make arrangements for the newly recruited disciples. The 5 realms of the East Continent are really troubled times, Sai. Perhaps he was affected by the tribulation Sword Sovereign, but Elder Qi sighed slightly. In the past 2 years, the great border of the East Continent had become less and less peaceful. Upheavals had occurred frequently. The most shocking thing was one of the holy lands of the Western world, the Divine Wind Palace. A year ago, Shun Xian, the Grand Elder of the Divine Wind Hall and a powerful figure in the East Continent, was killed at West Lake. The water area that stretched for thousands of miles turned into a poisonous swamp in an instant. Not even a blade of grass grew. Humans and animals died upon contact. This matter shocked the 5 realms of the East Continent and made everyone anxious. It had not calmed down until now. No one knew which cultivator had done it. Later, the cultivators of the Divine Wind Hall observed the scene and determined that there was not only one murderer. There were at least 2 or even 3. Moreover, the people who had done it were all very powerful. They were definitely above the cultivation level of a great emperor. They had attacked Emperor Sun Qian together. The traces of the battle at the scene were so tragic that it was shocking. According to rumors, there was a 10,000-mile saber mark that had cut off West Lake. The saber chi had evaporated the lake water. Then, the area within a 1,000-mile radius had turned into a poisonous swamp. This proved that there was a cultivator who was good at saber dao and medicine involved. Sun Qian might have been poisoned before the battle, but the fatal blow was a spell that blasted the great emperor's body into a sieve. Even his divine soul was annihilated in an instant. According to the analysis of the scene, it was obvious that the saber chi had not pierced through the divine soul and the great emperor's body. The other party's saber had been very powerful, and the saber mark was extremely fierce and domineering. Even though he had killed Sun Qian, a full-strength saber strike was enough to split his body. Perhaps the person who had used the saber was still lacking in cultivation and could not break through Sun Qian's defense. Therefore, with such a fatal spell, the Divine Firmament Hall judged that there were 3 people who were responsible, but they could not find out who it was. After all, there were not many people who had the ability to kill Emperor Sun Qian. There were only a few in the East Continent, and those few people had alibis. After a year, the Divine Firmament Hall still had not found anything, but they believed that the culprit was not in a good state. After all, Emperor Sun Qian was the Grand Master of the Divine Firmament Hall. His cultivation level had reached the ultimate enlightenment level. Some people even said that he had 1 foot in the unblemished realm. Even if many people worked together to kill him, they would also be injured. If Sun Qian had not been poisoned first, it was hard to say who would have died in the end. Therefore, if the Divine Firmament Hall discovered that any Grandmaster was injured by them, they would definitely be the culprit. Unfortunately, the results of their investigation showed that the Grandmasters of the various great empires were fine. No one was injured. Furthermore, Zhou Wendi, the Grandmaster of the Great Zhou Empire, was a guest at the sword sect of the southern region on the day of Emperor Sun Qian's death. Emperor Mu of the southern region personally testified that he was playing chess with Grandmaster Zhou. This matter was still an unsolved case. There were no clues. But there was a shocking rumor circulating in the East Continent. It was said that the descendant of that person had returned to seek revenge on Sun Qian. The martial artists of the East Continent all knew who that person represented. It was Dindi of the Daqin Empire. Under the Sunset Arrow, the emperor did not exist. Dindi cultivated pills and poisons. His descendant was definitely proficient in this field. Furthermore, Grandmaster Sun Qian's internal organs had been corroded, causing his body to wither. He could not unleash his Dao and was besieged to death. Furthermore, the terrifying blade marks on West Lake were similar to the style of Dinda's generals. All the martial artists of the East Continent spread the rumor that the descendant of that person had returned. At this moment, Qin Hao's lips curled into a cold smile. He naturally knew that Sun Qian was dead. Furthermore, on the night of the incident, he received a message from Guang He immediately. Sun Qian deserved to die. It was not easy to kill Guang He and the others, especially Zhou Wendi. He was severely injured by Sun Qian's counterattack. If not for Holy Emperor Zhong's timely rescue, Zhou Wendi would have been half dead. However, Zhou Wendi was smart. He found an excuse to not be in the East Continent and dragged the sword sect of the South Mountain Range into the water. Otherwise, the Great Zhou Empire and the Divine Firmament Hall could not avoid another war. With Zhou Wendi's injuries, he would not have the strength to fight again. Once they fought, even if they won, they would lose half of the Great Zhou Empire. It is indeed an eventful period. Elder Yu sighed. Not only the West World, but a murder case also happened in the Penglai continent. Although it was not as shocking as Grandmaster Sun Qian's sudden death, it was still not a small matter to the heaven-shaking tribe. This was because Grandmaster Han Tian's great-great-grandson was killed by a martial artist who passed by. He died without knowing what happened. The Yi tribe did not even know the name and appearance of the murderer. The Penglai continent's sea was sealed because of this. The sea was sealed for more than 2 years, and it was still not lifted. Furthermore, one of the 3 celestial beings of Penglai The Mu tribe, who was very close to Dinde in the East Continent, was taken into the territory of the Shuo tribe. Even though there was a battle with the Yi tribe that day, the Shuo tribe's attitude was very strong. They killed one of the Yi tribe's Emperor Yuan on the spot. If it wasn't for the fact that Fengya's matter was not resolved, a war would have broken out between the two tribes. In the end, the matter was left unsettled. The Yi tribe lost one of their Emperor Yuan's lives, and the Shuo tribe successfully took back the old and weak soldiers of the Mu tribe. Many people speculated whether Fengya's death was related to the Shuo tribe. But without real evidence, the heaven-shaking tribe did not dare to act rashly. Once they did, the consequences would be quite serious. The two tribes would fight to the death. Fengya was strangely slaughtered, and the Yi tribe lost two emperors. They were really unlucky. Of course, the Divine Firmament Hall suffered a greater blow. Their Grandmaster was killed, and they lost their biggest backer. The sect's influence in the West world was declining day by day. It was not hard to imagine that the Divine Firmament Hall would be finished soon if the current Temple Master could not shoulder the great responsibility. After all, in the West world, there were still overlord forces such as Jintao Sengoku, Heaven-Trampling Sect, Yintian Palace, and so on. They were always thinking of expanding their sect. Hearing this, Qin Hao smiled again. The Yi tribe, the Divine Firmament Hall, and the Mu tribe, everything was just the beginning. How he was harmed by those people back then, how the Mu tribe declined. In the future, those people would pay the same price one by one. In fact, these were not the only three things that happened in the 5 realms of the East Continent. In the land of Penglai, not long after Feng's death, a third-rate force called the Shark Sect was annihilated overnight. All 700 members of the sect were killed without leaving a single corpse. Similarly, the murderer was unknown, but the Shark Sect was a third-rate force after all. Compared to the sudden deaths of Fengya and the Divine Firmament Patriarch, it was insignificant and did not attract much attention. On the contrary, something big seemed to be happening in the southern world. Today in Nanjiang City, everyone saw the Shueiyao fairies go to the South Sky Peak. That Tribulation Sword Sovereign had attracted the attention of the supreme ruler of the Shueiyao Holy Nation. No one knew what would happen next. Our responsibility is to take care of the Taoist sect and let the foundation of our ancestors continue. As for the major events in the 5 realms, we don't have the heart to care, and we can't care at all. Jinhua, have you made the arrangements? Elder Qi asked with a sullen face. Grandpa, it's all arranged. This year, we recruited 137 disciples. A total of 8 people have soul power, but none of them have a spiritual power exceeding the 10th grade. Just now, I've already ordered people to prepare the records. The disciples can choose any place to cultivate. Sure, Jinhua said. Sai, it's getting worse year by year. All right, you do as you see fit. Elder Yu and I will go back and report to the sect master. Elder Qi and Elder Yu's bodies bloomed with light as they walked into the inner sect. Compared to the Taisui Mountain and the Void-Striking sect, the number of disciples and the advantages and disadvantages were obvious. If it continued to develop, the orthodoxy of the Taoist sect would be in danger. Unfortunately, the sect master and the 2 deputy sect masters came in person, but they couldn't invite the Tribulation Sword Sovereign. If that expert joined the Taoist sect, the strength of the 3 sects would inevitably change. It could even be said that the Tribulation Sword Sovereign alone was enough to support the world. According to his cultivation, the master of the Taisui Mountain and the Void-Striking Tao Emperor were no match for him, even if they joined forces. Once the Tribulation Sword Sovereign established his own sect, it was completely imaginable how great of a sensation it would cause in Nanjiang City. There would probably be countless disciples seeking the Taoist path, and it would seriously threaten the status of the 3 sections. Because of this, why would he come to the Taoist sect? Hey, your disciple can stay in the herb garden. He doesn't have to come to my Sword Valley to learn. After Elder Qi and Elder Yu left, Shi Jinhua used the attitude of a superior and indifferently preached to Qin Hao. Shi Dong was accepted by Qin Hao, so he didn't have to come to his Sword Valley. In other words, the Sword Valley didn't welcome Shi Dong. Elder Shi, you're too mean. Ching said with dissatisfaction. Since Sherdong had joined the Taoist sect, he was a disciple of the Taoist sect. Naturally, he was qualified to learn swordsmanship in the Sword Valley. What did Shi Jinhua mean by not letting him in? You don't have the right to speak. Next to her, a tall and thin young man who was so thin that his cheekbones could be seen spoke with a sharp look on his face. Shi Lang, the personal disciple of Shi Jinhua, was also the senior brother of the Sword Valley. Chapter 1647. Shi Lang had a sword soul and a 9th grade spiritual power. There was still a gap between him and Lu Guang, who was recruited by the Striking Void sect. However, among the Taoist disciples, he was considered to be one of the best. Moreover, as a junior of the Shi clan, he had a sense of superiority that other disciples did not have. The disciples of the Sword Valley all looked to him as their leader. His cultivation base was at the Mortal Saint realm, and he was Shi Jinhua's favorite disciple. In the entire Dao sect, there were only a handful of disciples who were more talented than Shi Lang. It could even be said that there was only one person who could overshadow him. At this moment, Shi Lang looked at Ching. Saintly might emanated from his body, and a wave of pressure swept out. All the disciples felt their bodies sink. Ching's cultivation was not as high as his, so she naturally could not resist. As for Shi Dong, who had just entered the Dao sect, how would he dare to face him? My swordsmanship didn't improve, but I learned the essence of it from Shi Jinhua. Qin Hao stood in front of Ching and released his profound sage-level aura, dispelling Shi Lang's pressure. The disciples immediately felt much better. You? Shi Lang's face was slightly angry. An alchemist dared to lecture him? In another 2 years, his cultivation would catch up to Qin Hao's. The Sword Valley imparted the Tao of the sword to the Dao sect. Since ancient times, they have never stopped their disciples. As the master of the Sword Valley, you have set a precedent. Is this the will of the Dao sect, or your own will? Qin Hao asked Shi Jinhua. If the Dao sect was like this, then there was nothing much to say. Although it is not the will of the Dao sect, I have the authority to decide the matters of the Sword Valley. When Shi Dong comes to the Sword Valley, none of the disciples will have lessons. Shi Jinhua said, if Shi Dong dared to come, the disciples of the Sword Valley would not be able to learn the sword. Jinhua, you're overreacting, Bo Sameo said solemnly. Even the rules of the ancestors were to be disobeyed. If the sect master removes me from my position because of this, I will have no complaints. Shi Jinhua's attitude was very firm, and he went against Shi Dong. All right, can you act like an elder? Shi Qing was a little angry. The foundation of Taoism was deteriorating year by year. Now that they were in need of people, it was impossible for them to remove Shi Jinhua from his position as the master of the Sword Valley. After all, the Shi family was a bloodline that Taoism could not afford to lose. Looking at Qin Hao, he said, not only does the Dao sect have the Valley of the Sword, Shi Dong may not necessarily have to learn the sword. Besides refining pills, he can come to the martial pavilion. After saying that, Shi Qing directly walked away. Obviously, the conflict between Qin Hao and Shi Jinhua had made her very angry. Let Shi Dong come to the martial pavilion to learn palm technique from me. Bo Sameo patted Qin Hao's shoulder, sighed, and turned to leave. Master, I've troubled you. Shi Dong lowered his head and realized that he had put Qin Hao in a difficult position by becoming a disciple of Taoism. Perhaps he shouldn't have come. There's no trouble between a master and a disciple. It's fine if he doesn't go to the Valley of Swords. In any case, his swordsmanship is poor and he won't be able to learn anything. Ching, take your junior brother with you. We're leaving. Qin Hao glanced at Shi Jinhua before the three of them headed towards the herb garden. That bastard. Shi Jinhua's face was gloomy, and his mood was extremely bad. Qin Hao had insisted on taking Qin Hao into Taoism. Now, he had even belittled the Sword Valley's swordsmanship in front of him. If it weren't for Old Man Yu, he would have taught Qin Hao a lesson today. In particular, Shi Qing's mood had also been ruined by Qin Hao. Master, don't be angry. It's not easy to get rid of Shi Dong. I'll share your burden. Shi Lang looked at Shi Dong's back and said, the martial pavilion? Oof. Not only could he not come to the Sword Valley, but he also could not go to the martial pavilion. During the practice, he could make sure Dong lie in bed for several months with a few casual moves. He did not even need Lang to do it himself. After all, Dong was vulnerable unless he hid in the herb garden and did not come out. Otherwise, he could not go anywhere in Taoism. When Qin Hao and his disciples returned to the herb garden, in the middle realm of the East Continent, there was a huge group of palaces standing in the sky above a bustling city. It was magnificent and full of aura. Sword light rushed into the sky, and figures on swords shuttled back and forth between the palaces. The huge group of buildings was as solemn as the heavenly palace. In the center of the countless palaces, there was an extremely bright divine temple. It was far taller than all the other palaces, like a divine court, and it flowed with astonishing sword will of the great path. This place was the famous holy land of the sword in the East Continent, the Zhuiying Sword Palace. That divine temple was the palace of Zhuiying the Great. It was surrounded by tens of thousands of sword palaces and was worshipped by countless swordsmen in the Middle Realm. In the eyes of the people of the East Continent, he was worthy of being called the Supreme Sword Lord. In the Sword Palace, terrible sword will flowed, silent, invisible, and formless. But when one stepped into it, it made one feel as if they were in a sea of swords, surviving in the waves of swords. Their spiritual souls were suppressed by the sword will at all times. At this time, in one place of the Sword Palace, there were hundreds of millions of divine swords hanging upside down, spewing out destructive light. Tens of thousands of swords flashed and clanged. Waves of sword will of the great path gathered below, and below was a huge sword pool. This was the place where the sword will of the Sword Palace was the most turbulent. There were hundreds of millions of divine swords above, all of which were the famous swords of the great ancestors of the Sword Palace. Only the personal disciples of the current Zhuiying Sword Lord were qualified to enter the sword pool and be tempered by the sword will of the past great ancestors. But now, there was someone from the outside world here. In the huge sword pool, a young man sat cross-legged. His shirtless body was covered with wounds. Looking at the wounds, it seemed that his flesh had been torn apart by the terrible might of thunder. There were streaks of lightning flashing between his flesh. The lightning and sword were intertwined. Above, hundreds of millions of divine swords were humming together. The terrible might of the sword pressed down, constantly removing the remaining might of thunder in the young man's body. This young man was Shou Wuk, the heir of the Sword Emperor of the southern region. Beside the sword pool, Feng Qianli looked on with a cold expression. His eyes were full of confusion and a trace of jealousy. He had never thought that one day Shou Wuk would be able to enter the sword pool of the Sword Palace and be baptized by the most sacred sword will of the past great ancestors. Only he and a few of his junior brothers were worthy of such glory. Shou Wuk was not a disciple of the Sword Palace. What did he do to deserve it? Are you confused? A voice sounded in the solemn palace. It was calm and natural, but it was full of supreme divine might. I don't understand. Why did you save him? Feng Qianli asked. When Shou Wuk came to Sword Palace, he was severely injured and on the verge of death. His sword heart, sword vein, sword body, and even his divine soul and sword will had suffered immeasurable damage. When his master went out, he brought him back to Sword Palace. At that time, Feng Qianli was shocked. Firstly, he was surprised that Shou Wuk appeared in the East Continent. Secondly, who hurt him so badly? Later, he learned that his master rescued him from the East Sea. Then, a series of accidents happened in Penglai, and Fanya was killed. This made Feng Qianli extremely vigilant. Moreover, the strong cultivator of the Ji tribe came to the Sword Palace in person and brought a portrait to the Zhuiying Sword Emperor to verify whether it was a disciple of the Sword Palace. The face of the person in the portrait was Qin Hao. At that time, Feng Qianli's heart almost jumped out of his chest. What surprised him was that when the strong cultivator of the Ji tribe asked, his master actually admitted that the person in the portrait was a disciple of his Sword Palace, who was ordered to travel, and also concealed the fact that Shou Wuk was seriously injured. The Ji tribe did not know that the Sword Palace had taken in Showuk, and the Jueying Sword Emperor admitted that the person in the portrait was his disciple. The strong cultivators of the Ji tribe who visited the Sword Palace could only leave in disappointment. Obviously, the answer given by the Jueying Sword Emperor was not the result they expected. It was just that Feng Qianli did not understand why his master would do this and take such a great risk. If the matter was exposed, it would inevitably set up a strong enemy for the Sword Palace. Sword Dao has no boundaries. Meeting is fate. Everything has a cause and effect. The voice of the Jueying Sword Emperor sounded in the palace. So, has Master ever thought of causing the dissatisfaction of the Ji tribe? Feng Qianli asked, "What do you think of the Ji tribe about the Mu tribe?" Without giving Feng Qianli an answer, the Jueying Sword Emperor asked the other party. Feng Qianli was startled and silent. He naturally knew the historical events of the East Continent. Old Emperor Mu was defeated by the Sunset War God and imprisoned in the Sunset Divine Peak. The Mu tribe lost their backer and was tragically robbed by the Sky Shaker. To be fair, the Ji tribe was undoubtedly a robber, not a gentleman's conduct. But from another perspective, the Ji tribe took advantage of the Mu tribe's weakness and kicked them off the overlord force in one fell swoop. In the Penglai territory, the status of the Sky Shaker tribe was guaranteed and its influence expanded. Ancestor Han Tian's actions were very wise. If it were Feng Qianli, he would do the same. After all, it was for the future of the family. Do you think the Ji tribe is right? The Jueying Sword Emperor said, "If the Mu tribe was in the Sword Palace, one day I would die in the hands of the Sunset War God, and the Ji tribe wanted to seize the Sword Palace. What would you do?" Disciple and the Ji tribe are irreconcilable. Feng Qianli's answer was very straightforward. But there will never be a day when the Sword Palace is no match for the Daqin. The Jueying Sword Emperor laughed, and his laughter echoed in the palace. There won't be a day. Who can guarantee? The East Continent was no longer as harmonious as it was when Dinda suppressed it. Now the Daqin was even more ambitious, but it still lacked the capital to unify the East Continent. If it really had the capital, the Sword Palace would no longer exist. Qianli, all the martial artists in the middle world know that you can cut 3,000 miles with one sword. The disciples of the Sword Palace regard you as their leader and worship you, but in my opinion, your sword is still too short. What was a sword? If today, it was not him who saved Showuk, but the southern region's Sword Emperor who saved Feng Qianli, then would Feng Qianli hope that the Sword Emperor would hand him over? The sword had no boundary, and the Dao had no boundary. Sword cultivators were just a speck of dust among the masses. Even as dust, who would be willing to be mud and be stepped on by others? Dust also longed to move forward with the storm. Showuk's sword should not end here. The divine wilderness needed such a sword. The vast Taoist mountains stretched endlessly. There were many dojos in the mountains, such as gardens, sword valleys, spiritual pagodas, martial pavilions, and so on. It was extremely huge. Even if it was getting worse with each generation, its ancestral heritage was not something the striking Void Sect and Tai Sui Mountain could compare with. There were thousands of disciples in the Taoist sect. They were divided into the outer sect and the inner sect. Those below the Saint Realm were the outer sect, and those above were the inner sect. There were many outer sect disciples, and they were taught by elders who guarded a dojo. For example, Shi Jinhua of the Sword Valley, Shanqing of the Spiritual Pagoda, and Bosameo of the Martial Pavilion. The outer sect disciples could go to any dojo to cultivate, but each elder also had a direct disciple. As for the inner sect, there were higher-ups in charge of preaching. The sect master was Shanqing's father. The two deputy sect masters were the clan master of the Shi clan and the clan master of the Bo clan. The three sect masters were all strong Renwang. Of course, when the Taoist sect was founded, there were more aristocratic families than just the three clans. Now, the Taoist sect was no longer as glorious as before. Many aristocratic families had withdrawn from the Taoist sect, leaving only the three most important clans to guard their ancestral heritage. In Qin Hao's opinion, the Taoist sect was now between the first-rate and third-rate forces. At best, it could be regarded as a second-rate force. But compared to the real second-rate forces, it was actually much weaker. For example, Taisui Mountain and the Striking Void sect had higher cultivation and the quality of their disciples than the Taoist sect. Once they fought, they were no match for the two sections. This was the current situation of the Taoist sect. The inner sect was maintained by the three clan masters, Si, Shi, and Bo. The outer sect dojos were taught by low-level elders. "Master, what are you looking at?" In the herb garden, Qingqing put down the bucket and squatted beside Qin Hao. 2 years had passed, and the girl's figure had become more and more plump, exuding a charm. Qin Hao did not reply. His deep eyes pierced through the sky and landed on the main peak of the Taoist sect. This main peak looked old, but it gave off a strange feeling. It was like a giant peak that was alive. Moreover, it contained a shocking power. Qin did not know if others felt this way, but he had the all-spirits body and was extremely sensitive to spiritual qi. It could be said that Qin Hao's physical body was the condensation of the essence of spiritual qi. His eyes could see through the essence that many people could not. Only the main peak of the Taoist sect could not be seen through. It was like the moon in the water. The more he looked at it, the more illusory it became. It was as if it was close, but also far away. Chapter 1648. The Taoist peak hid the Taoist way and was protected by the supreme Taoist will. Therefore, he could not see through it. Qingqing, tell me more about the legend of the Taoist ancestor. Qin Hao said. He pushed away the wet soil with both hands, threw the medicinal herb seeds down, and carefully sealed the soil. I've told you many times. Qingqing refused. I want to hear more. Qin Hao looked at her with a smile. I'm impressed. Well, you're my only master. I'll reluctantly tell you one more time. Qingqing pretended to be mature. She put her hands behind her back and walked back and forth in front of Qin Hao, telling the story of the Taoist sect again. Once upon a time, the Taoist sect was glorious. It stood in the southern world, and its reputation spread across the East continent. That was the most glorious era of the Taoist sect. Qingqing didn't know how glorious it was. It should be about the same as the current Daqin Empire. At that time, there was no water in the southern world, no Jade Holy Country, no Vajra Academy, and no Sword and Wind people. Only the Taoist sect enjoyed the glory. Cough, cough. You don't have to talk about the Taoist sect. Qin Hao gestured for her to get to the point. Without the Taoist sect, there is no Taoist ancestor. You think I'm long-winded? I'm not going to tell you. Qingqing threw a tantrum. Okay. Tell me. Qin Hao obediently shut up. Don't interrupt me. Qingqing waved her fist and threatened. My cultivation is about to catch up with yours. Are you going to betray me? Qin Hao pretended to be vigilant and afraid. Don't interrupt. Okay. I won't interrupt. Just tell me. Humph. Qingqing snorted and scratched her head. Where's I just now? Oh, by the way, the Taoist sect was brilliant and dominated the world. The disciples of that era were all peerless talents. During the heyday of the Taoist sect, there were many members of the aristocratic families. Within each clan, there were countless geniuses. There were only 3 people who were the most outstanding. The Ji clan, the Shi clan, and the Bo clan each had one. They suppressed the heroes of the southern world. The 3 geniuses were born in the same year and grew up together. They were very close to each other. They swore to strengthen the sect and create the strongest sect in the East continent. Qingqing's words evoked the memories buried deep in Qin Hao's heart. In his mind, the faces of senior brother Eastern Sky and Shi Mu appeared clearly. The legend of the Tao ancestor was related to his 2 senior brothers. However, the Tao ancestor himself was not the 2 of them. He was the last of the 3 peerless geniuses. Feng Dong, Shi Mu, and Bo Changji were born during the golden age of the Tao Gate. Moreover, they were geniuses among geniuses during that era. No one in the southern world could compare to them. One could imagine how outstanding his talent was. Later, there was a sign from the Divine Palace and the birth of the Divine Sword Emblem. How Taoism sent geniuses to respond to the sign. Shi Dong and Shi Mu were the representatives of Haoyan Taoism. They crushed their opponents along the way and went to the South Pole Holy Land. Bo Changji naturally wanted to go as well. He even sneaked away and wanted to participate with Eastern Sky and Shi Mu. However, he was caught by the elders of the Tao Gate. After all, the Tao Gate could not be without its inheritance. The departure of Eastern Sky and Shi Mu had already hurt the elders of the Tao Gate. How could they let the three of them go? Bo Changji was left behind. From then on, there was no smile on his face. In the past, when it came to martial arts, only Eastern Sky and Shi Mu could compete with him. After the two of them left, it was as if they had taken Bo Changji's soul with them. He eventually turned from a reckless young man into an old-fashioned and serious old man. The Tao Ancestor was the respectful title that the later generations of the Tao Gate called Bo Changji. Although he lost the opportunity to enter the Divine Palace, his talent was still unshakable. Especially after Eastern Sky and Shi Mu left, the strength of his martial arts was reflected to the extreme. No one in the current generation of the Southern world could withstand a blow from Bo Changji. They were all crushed. From then on, Bo Changji, the Tao Ancestor, became the symbol of the Tao Gate. He was known as the invincible god of the Southern world. However, he was not happy. He was born ignorant and ended up depressed. He died young. At the moment before his death, his eyes were fixed in the direction of the South Pole, as if he saw the return of the people he had been looking forward to. Heaven is jealous of talents. It's a pity that I was not born in the era of the Tao Ancestor. Otherwise, the Tao Gate would have 4 geniuses guarding it. The great ancestor would not have died alone. It's really a pity. Speaking of this, Yin Qingqing raised her hand and wiped her tears. She cried as if she wished she could travel through time and space. According to Bo Changji's last wish, I buried his body at the bottom of the main peak. Although the Tao Ancestor was dead, his soul guarded the Tao Gate. His soul turned into the peak of the Tao Gate, forever protecting the Tao Gate. As long as the peak existed, so did his soul. He would wait until the day he reunited with his old friend. Phew! Qin Hao let out a long breath. Although he had heard of it many times, every time Yin Qingqing talked about it, his heart would surge with heroism and waves. This was really a respectable and sad story. Of the 3 geniuses of the Tao Gate, 2 left and 1 stayed. Those who left did not return, and those who stayed died early. What are you sighing for? Actually, no matter if the story is true or false, along with the passage of time, many Tao temples in the Tao sect have gradually become dilapidated. Only that main peak is still young and glowing with vitality. It's sufficiently miraculous. Moreover, the Tao Gate has existed for thousands of years. During this period, it has encountered many great crises. Every time a major change occurs, a strange sound will come from a main peak to intimidate the enemy and make the invaders not dare to overstep their boundaries. I don't know if the Tao Ancestor is still alive or if his obsession has not dissipated, protecting the Tao Gate until today. Yin Qingqing also looked at the peak. She was like an immortal pine tree, and her heart was filled with respect. As a child born and raised in the southern land of the East Continent, Yin Qingqing's family had lived at the foot of the mountain for generations. Naturally, she grew up listening to the stories of the Tao Gate. The legend of the Tao Ancestor was what she yearned for the most. However, as a matter of fact, if the ancestral spirit of the Tao Peak had not dissipated, the sect would not have declined to such a state. It was an overlord force of an era, but it was surpassed by the later generations. It was fine that it could not compare to the Water Jade Emperor, the Vajra Academy, and the Sacred Sword Wind People. Now, even the people of the Airstrike sect and the Tai Sui Mountain dared to point at the Tao Gate and speak loudly. The spirit of the Tao Ancestor would have been blown away by the wind. The story is over. Let's go back and cook. Yin Qingqing picked up the bucket and was about to go to the kitchen in the herb garden. Qin Hao sat quietly where he was, still thinking about the legend of the Tao Ancestor. He looked at the main peak again, and his pupils gradually turned into the luster of flames. An invisible emperors will shroud it down, but it could not reach the main peak. It was as if it was blocked in midair by some kind of force. So powerful. Qin Hao's brows furrowed slightly. It had been more than 2 years since he entered the Tao Gate, and he had lived here for almost 4 years. Every day, he refined his emperor's will in the 5 spirits, earthly chi of the South Sky Peak. He did not dare to slack off. Now, his cultivation had reached the 7th tier of the Tao realm, and he was a genuine, unblemished emperor according to his senior sister. If he fought with Hui Tong again, Qin Hao did not need to use the power of the dragon. He could defeat Hui Tong with his fists alone. Even if he encountered a Tao emperor now, he could not say for sure that he would win, but he would definitely not lose. But his emperor's will could not even touch a single peak, let alone see through it. As Qing said, the spirit of the Tao ancestor had really been blown away by the wind. Or rather, the Tao ancestor was not dead. Qin Hao did not know whether the Tao peak was protected by the ancestral spirit, and whether the Tao ancestor was really dead or not. However, he knew one thing, and that was that the peak was alive. It was like a living person, and it contained an incomparably terrifying power. This power had always been hidden in the peak. It just did not erupt. Qin Hao found it hard to imagine. His cultivation was comparable to that of a Tao emperor, but he could not even peek into the Tao peak. Once that power erupted, what a shocking scene it would be. Perhaps the true self-great emperor, who was at the 2nd tier of the Tao realm, would be like a child drinking milk in front of the Tao peak. After cooking, Qin Hao asked Qing to go to the martial pavilion. Sherdong had cultivated in the martial pavilion for a few days, and Qin Hao needed to test his cultivation. Sherdong was different from the other disciples of the Tao Gate. As Qin Hao had guessed, his bloodline had not awakened. However, it was not easy to awaken Sherdong's bloodline. Even though Qin Hao's alchemy skills were extraordinary, he did not dare to be careless. He was afraid that an external awakening would damage the power of Sherdong's bloodline. An external awakening would definitely not be as effective as one's own awakening. Therefore, there could not be any mistakes in cultivation. After all, this child was Shi Mu's direct descendant and shouldered the mission of the Tao Gate's prosperity. The elder guarding the martial pavilion was Bo Sameo. He was proficient in the Tao Gate's martial arts techniques and was good at close combat. In particular, his ancestral technique, the yin-yang dual polarity palm, was extremely fierce and domineering. It could be said to be the most complete and lethal technique in the Tao Gate. Today, Bo Sameo would teach the martial pavilion's disciples the secrets of the yin-yang dual polarity palm. Absorb the spiritual chi of heaven and earth, gather yin and yang, reach the 9 meridians, and connect to the chi si. Yang is real, yin is illusory, and yin is illusory. Yin and yang are unpredictable. When the palm strikes, it can shatter mountains, break the martial body, and kill the enemy in one blow. In a training hall, Bo Sameo explained the essentials with an extremely serious attitude. Even though many of the disciples present today were not from the martial pavilion, no matter which sect they were from, they were still disciples of the Tao Gate. He would not be biased. On this point, he was similar to Elder Qi. Now that you're gradually getting used to the yin-yang dual polarity chi flowing through your meridians at the same time, many of you can bear it. Remember, with the 9 meridians, the power of the yin-yang dual polarity chi will increase exponentially. It is not a dream to kill enemies of a higher level. Find an opponent to practice with, and don't go too far. Bo Sameo instructed. His duty was to teach the techniques, but the specific cultivation of the disciples depended on them. Bo Sameo left the training hall to the disciples and returned to the platform. He brewed tea to moisten his throat. For a moment, the quiet disciples in the training hall stood up and began to find opponents. Martial arts techniques needed to be practiced. Today, they were practicing with their fellow disciples. Perhaps tomorrow, they would use it on their enemies. Many disciples found suitable opponents. The yin-yang dual polarity chi gathered, and the Tao light flickered around them. At this moment, the young man was sitting in place, but did not move. It was Sherdong. Although he did not find someone to practice with, the yin-yang Tao light flickered around Sherdong's body. He closed his eyes and cultivated his hair flying. Obviously, he did not slack off. Junior brother Sherdong is very hardworking. Why don't you find someone to test you? At this moment, a person walked over. It was Shur Lang of the Sword Valley, followed by a large number of disciples of the Sword Valley. He was quite popular. Sherdong did not reply. It was not that he was afraid of the other party. He had entered the Tao sect for 2 years and learned alchemy from Qin Hao for 2 years. His temperament and cultivation had changed greatly. He was naturally not the same as when he first entered. Moreover, Qin Hao had warned him that without his permission, he was not allowed to spar with any disciples of the Tao sect. He would naturally obey his master's words. Hey, senior brother Shirlang is asking you a question. Are you mute? A disciple of the Sword Valley said unhappily. Sherdong still did not say a word. He did not even open his eyes. You really think you're a big shot? The disciple of the Sword Valley rolled up his sleeves, wanting to teach Sherdong a lesson. Don't be rough with great Master Qin's disciple. What if you hurt him? Shirlang stopped him. Of course it was fake. In his heart, he wanted to beat Sherdong up. He had waited for 2 years. Unfortunately, during these 2 years, Sherdong had been hiding in the herb garden and did not take half a step out. It was only in the past few days that he began to walk around other training halls. Today, he was caught red-handed by Shirlang. Junior brother Sherdong, you're quite serious. However, cultivation alone is not enough. You have to practice it. You have to hit someone. Only then will they know how painful it is. Why don't we exchange a few moves? Shirlang squatted down and stared at Sherdong's face with a smile. He really wanted to kick Sherdong's face a few times. Chapter 1649. The two of them were so close that Sherdong could even feel the other's breath on his face. He slowly opened his eyes and said, I'm not your opponent. It wasn't that he was afraid of fighting, but the truth. Shirlang was the leader of the Sword Valley, and there was almost no one in the Taoist sect who could defeat him. Even if there was, it was definitely not Sherdong, at least not now. After all, he had just entered the Taoist sect for 2 years. Oh, so that's what you're worried about. Don't be nervous. I will suppress my cultivation and try not to hurt you. Or I can spar with others. Shirlang smiled and gave a look to a disciple of the Sword Valley. The disciple took a heavy step forward and rubbed his fist excitedly. Come on, junior brother Sherdong, let me take a few more of your palms. I'm willing to use my flesh and blood to help you hone your martial arts skills. At this moment, all the disciples of the Sword Valley were excited and couldn't wait to see Sherdong make a fool of himself. Sherdong glanced at the disciple and said, I don't want to spar with you. Senior brother, find someone else. Don't say that. I'm willing. Hit me as much as you want. Don't be soft-hearted, the disciple said. Sherdong breathed a sigh of relief and looked at him. He advised, but you're not my opponent. It's better not to fight, lest you become a joke. The disciple was stunned. He was not Sherdong's opponent. Was he looking down on him? Was he being looked down on? You must have gone crazy from refining medicine in the herb garden, spitting out such delirious words. I just complimented you a little, and you actually took advantage of my face. Then don't blame me for being merciless. The disciple of the Sword Valley was furious. He couldn't tolerate being looked down on by the useless disciple of the useless great Master Qin. If he didn't make a move today, he would be laughed at by the other disciples of the Sword Valley. He was about to release his cultivation to scare Sherdong. Suddenly, a beam of orange flame rose from in front of him, and the air waves spread out violently, forcing the disciples of the Sword Valley to retreat repeatedly. At this time, the saint's aura swept out and suppressed the training hall. The disciple of the Sword Valley who was speaking loudly was shocked to find that Sherdong's body was bathed in orange flame, and his hair was dancing like a saint. Saint realm. Suddenly, the training hall was in an uproar. The holy aura that permeated the air swept across the entire place like a gust of wind. Looking at Sherdong, who was bathed in orange flames, all the disciples trembled with fear. Pooh! The tea in Bo Sameo's mouth splashed 3 feet away. He was dumbfounded, and the shock in his heart was no less than the disciples in the training hall. Saint Realm. It had been more than 2 years since Sherdong entered the Taoist sect. Thinking back, Dong was only a young brat in the early stage of the Gathering Element realm. Unknowingly, he had actually stepped into the saint plane of the martial arts. How shocking was that? At this moment, Dong was the absolute focus of the training ground. Countless pairs of eyes were fixed on him. Judging from his aura, he was only a lower mortal saint. Perhaps he had just broken through not long ago. After all, the orange light he emitted was very thin. But a saint was a saint after all, and the might of a saint was not fake. How is this possible? The disciple of the Sword Valley who was shouting loudly and mercilessly was dumbfounded. His legs were trembling uncontrollably, and his heart was in turmoil. The scene before his eyes was simply unbelievable. Almost everyone in the Taoist sect knew that Dong had a first-grade spirit root and a third-grade spiritual power. With the lowest aptitude in martial arts, he was destined not to achieve much in his life. Even if he grew up, he would only be a little stronger than ordinary people. He could be said to be the weakest martial artist in the East Continent. Who would have dared to imagine that he could become a saint? Of course, the aptitude test by the sect was only a rough estimate. In reality, there would be some fluctuations because everyone had potential. But in any case, there were examples of people with first-grade spirit roots who had cultivated to the master origin level. It was impossible for them to surpass the ancestor origin level, let alone transcend mortality and become a saint. But Dong had really become a saint. It was a living miracle. What the hell? Their legs trembled more and more. After the shock, fear swept through their bodies. The disciples who were fighting with Dong immediately cowered in the face of the holy aura. How could they fight? He was only in the 8th stage of the ancestor origin level. There were 3 natural barriers in martial arts. The saint plane was the first. It was a huge divide. Outside the saint plane, one was mortal. Once one entered the saint plane, one shed their mortal body and comprehended the true essence of martial arts. The human sovereign realm was the second, and the martial emperor realm was the third. However, these 2 barriers were too far away from the disciples of the Taoist sect. They might not be able to reach them in their lifetime. However, at this moment, the disciple of the Valley of Swords knew very well that he was no match for Dong. A saint was a saint after all, unless one was extremely talented, like Lu Guang of the Striking Sky sect, who was born with 2 souls and a 5th-grade spiritual power that would have the ability to challenge those of a higher level. Unfortunately, this disciple could not compare to Lu Guang. Moreover, Lu Guang's cultivation was only at the level of he would definitely be stronger than Dong. Lu Guang might even surpass Lang. After all, a 5th-grade spiritual power cultivation speed was extremely terrifying. The martial pavilion was silent. At this moment, everyone was shocked by the shock brought by Dong. Lang of the Valley of Swords was naturally equally shocked. He could not understand how Dong, who had a first-grade spirit root, could become a saint. What kind of monster was the great Master Qin in the Her Garden? How did he train Dong? Aha! The Her Garden is an important place in the sect. It controls the resources of the sect. Great Master Qin is not the owner of the Her Garden for nothing. Taking a deep breath, Lang suppressed his emotions. Soon he figured out how many expensive tonics did Qin Hao feed his disciple, and how many resources did he steal from the sect to make Dong like this. Since that was the case, Lang did not need to hide anymore. A battle between saints should be possible. He said, "Let me see what junior brother Dong is capable of." After saying that, he took 2 steps back. The primordial chi around Lang surged, and an orange light bloomed. The saint path pressure that filled his body instantly surpassed Dong's. It was the profound saint realm. He was also improving. "I said, I don't want to fight," Dong said. He showed his cultivation level only to let the disciples of the Valley of Swords know the difficulty and retreat. The most important reason was that Qin Hao did not allow him to fight with others. What are you afraid of? That Qin guy used the resources of the sect to feed you until you were fat and strong. Wasn't it all for this day? He has achieved his goal. Lang sneered. "Don't slander my master." Dong's face tightened, and a trace of anger flashed in his eyes. Shi Dong has just entered the mortal saint realm. It's a bit unfair for you to fight with him. At this time, a disciple of the martial pavilion spoke up and took 2 steps forward. He had thick eyebrows and big eyes, and his face was upright. Bo Minghua was Bo Simeo's disciple and the eldest senior brother of the martial pavilion. What does it have to do with you? Shi looked at Bo Minghua. The other party was also a profound saint, but Shi really did not care about him. Please enlighten me. Bo Minghua raised his hand and gathered yin and yang. Light flashed around his body, and his saint force raged. He did not want to be the first, but he could not bear to see Shi so arrogant. Haha, you asked for it. Shi looked slightly at the platform and saw that Bo Simeo, the elder of the martial pavilion, was drinking tea. It was naturally not good for the elders to intervene in a competition between disciples. Thinking of this, Shi fiercely blasted a palm toward Bo Minghua. Saint force gushed out, and the Tao turned into yin and yang. In a competition between the martial pavilion, it was natural to use the martial techniques of the martial pavilion. Bo Minghua saw the yin and yang palm light blasting toward him. It was fierce and overbearing, and he did not dare to be careless. After all, his cultivation was lower than Shi by 2 stages, but in terms of yin and yang dual polarity palms, Bo Minghua, who was from the Bo family, was not necessarily inferior. The profound saint force connected the 8 meridians of the martial path. The yin and yang qi between Bo Minghua's palms became more and more abundant, dazzling, and a majestic momentum was formed. His palms were like thunder, and the palm light flew out and collided with Shi palm print. There was an explosion in the platform, and Shi palm light suddenly collapsed. Good palm technique, Shi Dong praised. Senior brother Bo Minghua's yin and yang qi was obviously better than Shi. Destroy. Shi face was unhappy, and he sent out another palm to disperse Bo Minghua's palm qi. However, the latter's moves were like a gust of wind, and his continuous attacks did not stop. In Bo Minghua's view, it was a rare opportunity to fight with Shi. After all, among the disciples of the martial pavilion, there were few who could be on par with him, and he should take this opportunity to hone his dual polarity palms. Bo Minghua did not stop, but Shi gradually felt that he could not bear it. After a few more palms, he had already retreated several feet. In terms of palm techniques, he did not have the upper hand. After all, this was the martial technique that the disciples of the Bo family were good at. Buzz. The radiance of the great Tao of yin and yang appeared behind Bo Minghua. His understanding of the yin and yang dual polarity palms was far beyond the knowledge of the disciples of the Tao sect. He was very clear on how to use it skillfully and how to make the palm power stronger. At this moment, this palm was his deepest understanding of palm techniques, and it was a good opportunity to verify it with Shi. Even if he was defeated, he could perfect his palm technique from the failure. Shi retreated several feet, and a lot of sweat flowed down his cheeks. Bo Minghua's imposing manner brought him a faint pressure, and at this moment, the other party was obviously going all out. If he used palm techniques to deal with it, he was likely to lose. This was a result that Shi could not accept because he was the senior brother of the Sword Valley. Sword of the Way. Shi stepped on the ground, and the dojo shook. A sword will suddenly burst out, and it was incomparably sharp. Immediately, a sword mark appeared behind him, and its folds shone brightly. He chanted the sword mantra of the Shi clan, and the sword mark shone brightly, and the sound of the sword shook the void. When Bo Minghua's last palm came crashing down, Shi held the glorious sword in his hand and infused it with saint power. The sword slashed down and split the yin and yang palm light. Suddenly, sword chi raged, and countless sword chi flashed out and fell on Bo Minghua's body. Poof! Bo Minghua spat out a mouthful of vermilion blood, and he staggered back. Countless sword holes appeared on his clothes, and his upper body was stained with blood. He had lost. Shi, you have an unfair advantage. The disciples of the martial pavilion shouted. Today, Elder Bo had taught him palm techniques, but Shi Lang had used the sword techniques of the Sword Valley to fight. What was the reason for this? What are you all arguing about? Even Elder Bo has no objection, so why are you all talking so much? Shi Lang smiled disapprovingly and glanced at Bo Minghua. Your palm technique is not bad, but unfortunately, it can't compare to the sword of the Sword Valley. After that, he held the sword mark in his hand and walked towards Shi Dong step by step. The sword mark spewed out the light of the profound saint. Come, junior brother Shi Dong, let me have a taste of your skills. Let me see if the resources that Qin Hao wasted on you are of value. Without waiting for Shi Dong to respond, Shi Lang's sword light directly slashed down, and sword chi of more than 10 feet fell on Shi Dong's head. At this moment, the stone floor where Shi Dong was sitting cracked inch by inch, and the sword chi sank half a foot deep. Obviously, this was not a sparring session, but he wanted to leave something on Shi Dong's body. Chapter 1650. You don't know your limits. On the platform, Bo Sameo frowned. This sword was obviously beyond Shi Dong's ability to withstand, and he had to stop it. At this time, a woman's figure descended from the sky and stepped into the martial pavilion. The moment the sword light struck, the woman yelled, and a gray pestle appeared in her hand, blocking the sword light with all her might. The power of the profound saint flowed on Yin Qingqing's body, and the pestle flashed with intense light. As the sword light struck, the pestle let out an ear-piercing sound, and the light suddenly collapsed. Yin Qingqing's hands were numb from the shock, and she stepped back. The blood in her body was in turmoil, and her face was somewhat pale. Senior sister. Shi Dong stood up. It was not easy for Yin Qingqing to withstand this sword. Joining forces? Then let me see what you've learned from Qin Hao. Shi Lang still did not give up. He activated his sword technique, and saint power flowed into the sword seal in his hand. In the pavilion, sword chi raged, forming a terrible sword chi whirlwind. The sword wind whistled, and Shi Dong's expression changed. This power was not something that he and his senior sister could withstand. Shi Lang was taking advantage of his high cultivation level to go too far. However, there was no shame on Shi Lang's face. He looked at Shi Dong with disdain. His sword chi rolled up a terrible whirlwind, and he waved it at Shi Dong and Yin Qingqing arrogantly. Stop! Bo Sameo yelled. Along with this, a yin and yang palm suddenly flew out from somewhere in the pavilion. The saint power was extremely strong, and it slammed toward Shi Lang. As soon as the palm appeared, Shi Lang immediately felt the pressure sweeping over. He looked over and saw a young man with an extraordinary temperament standing there. It was him. Shi Lang's arrogant expression became serious. The spiritual pagoda's Xuan Xiao was the only one who was qualified and strong enough to contend with him. It could even be said that Xuan Xiao's cultivation level was higher than his. Shi Lang naturally did not dare to be careless. Saint power surged into the sword seal, and it changed direction, abandoning Shi Dong and slashing toward the yin and yang palm. Boom! A deafening sound rang out. This palm strike caused the whirlwind of sword light to disperse and landed heavily on Shi Lang's body. Although he blocked it with his sword seal, he was still pushed back more than 10 meters, and his figure was in a sorry state. Xuan Xiao. All the disciples looked at that person with admiration and a kind of fear in their eyes. Although Xuan Xiao's strength was tyrannical, he was not to be provoked. However, his character was even more than Shi Lang's. Humph! Shi Lang swallowed the blood in his throat. He already knew that Xuan was very strong, but after exchanging blows, it turned out to be more troublesome than he had imagined. However, Shi Lang refused to accept the fact that Shi Lang wanted to suppress him with a single palm strike. An even more violent sword intent gushed out. The sword imprint in Shi Lang's hand exploded with a resplendent light. The disciples felt as if the sword imprint had solidified into a physical entity, following which the sword imprint split apart, transforming into over 10 streams of light that blasted towards Bayan. A cold smile flashed across Tao Wu's face, and his expression was one of disdain. He stepped on the ground, and flames of the way burned on his body. A low roar of a Qilin came from within his body, and everyone could hear it clearly. When beams of sword Dao light fell, Dong could clearly see that the flames burning on Swanee's body formed a huge illusory image of a Qilin divine beast, protecting it in the middle. Beams of sword Dao light entered the illusory image and merged with the Qilin Dao fire, burning into nothingness. Dong said. Lang's expression also changed greatly. Was he that strong? Tao Wu's Qilin soul forcibly withstood the attack of the soul essence sword mark. Even its Dao body could not be broken, so it was unscathed. Roar! At this moment, a berserk roar resounded. The gigantic Qilin phantom moved as if it was flying, and in the blink of an eye, it had already arrived above Lang's head. The beast palm that was wrapped in surging flames pressed down and stopped on Lang's forehead. Lang looked at the palm on his forehead. He was so scared that his face turned pale. His face was covered in cold sweat. Your swordsmanship isn't bad, but it's a pity that it's far inferior to my Qilin Dao fire. Tao Wu withdrew his primordial soul, and the flames around him dissipated. He also moved his palm away from Lang's forehead. He was just trying to scare Lang. Of course, if this wasn't a competition between fellow disciples of the same sect, Lang would have ceased to exist. At this moment, Lang stood there in a daze, as if he had lost his soul. He was intimidated by the shadow of the palm print. The other disciples looked at Swan Xiong in awe. This was the true number one person among the younger generation of Taoism. Even someone as strong as Lang of the Sword Valley was no match for him. If there was anyone in Taoism who could compete with Lu Guang of the Sky Striking sect, it had to be Tao Wu. In the future, only Tao Wu was qualified to compete with Lu Guang. Thank you. Dong stepped forward and said sincerely. Tao Wu suppressed Lang and resolved the crisis for him. Moreover, Tao Wu was indeed strong and worthy of respect. Tao Wu glanced at Dong and said coldly, "Trash." In the face of Lang's repeated provocations, he didn't even dare to fight back. How could he be a disciple of Taoism? What nonsense are you talking about? Yin Qingqing said angrily. She naturally couldn't bear to see her junior brother being humiliated. Did I say something wrong? Tao Wu looked at Yin Qingqing coldly and said with a smile, "A man who didn't fight back and didn't talk back. Was he if not trash? How much resources did Qin Hao use for Taoism and waste on you two incompetent people? You really don't let him down. I feel tired for Qin Hao. Apologize to me." Dong's face darkened, and there seemed to be a fighting spirit between his brows. "Oh, you dare to fight back now?" Tao Wu was a little surprised that a useless person who didn't dare to face Lang had the guts to face him. "You can humiliate me, but you can't humiliate my master. Apologize." Dong shouted loudly. That person in the herb garden had shown him great kindness and had given him a new lease on life. The kindness of a teacher was like a father. If he didn't get this apology, Dong would not hesitate to go against Qin Hao and attack Tao Wu. Even if he couldn't win, he would still fight. Dong, Qingqing, come back for dinner." At this time, a voice sounded in the air. Everyone looked up and found that great Master Qin of the herb garden had come to the martial pavilion and was floating there. "Master, he slandered you. I will never let him go." Dong resisted and couldn't suppress his desire to attack Tao Wu. Bo Sameo saw this and shrugged helplessly at Qin Hao. He couldn't be blamed for today's matter. "You don't have to come back to the herb garden to see me." Qin Hao didn't say much. He nodded at Bo Sameo and turned to fly back to the herb garden. "Master." Dong knew that Qin Hao was angry. He hurriedly chased after him with Yin Qingqing and didn't forget to look back at Tao Wu. Tao Wu smiled frivolously and didn't avoid Dong's gaze. He raised half of his pinky in the air and strode out of the martial pavilion, leaving a proud back view for everyone. This kid. Bo Sameo shook his head and smiled bitterly. Tao Wu was indeed talented, but because of this he was spoiled and didn't know how to be humble. After the small incident in the martial pavilion, all the disciples returned to their respective dojos. Lang also returned to the Valley of Swords. He was prepared to teach Dong a lesson today to win Jinhua's favor and show off his skills. But who would have thought that in the end, Bian would appear and steal the limelight, and even put Shi Lang in a very sorry state? Usually, the disciples of Taoism would always compare them to each other, arguing about who is the number one. After today, there would be no more arguments. Tao Wu deserved to be the strongest in Taoism, but Shi Lang was labeled as the disgraceful number two. Chapter 1651. Qin Hao led the group back to the herb garden, and the disciples dispersed. Bo Sameo, the elder of the martial pavilion, thought for a moment and felt that it was necessary to report to the higher-ups. After all, what happened to Shi Dong was too shocking. First-grade spiritual root, third-grade spiritual power, and in less than 3 years, he entered the Saint realm from the early stage of elemental gathering realm. It was unbelievable. Bo Sameo did not know how Qin Hao did it. In the past, in the Taoist sect, and even in the 5 realms of the East Continent, such an improvement was extremely rare. Of course, this did not include the monstrous geniuses in the overlords. Those people were born with powerful bloodlines and abundant cultivation resources. The Taoist sect's manpower and physical strength could not be compared to the overlords. "Master, why don't you let me teach Tao Chen a lesson?" Shi Dong asked after returning to the herb garden. No one in the world could criticize Qin Hao in front of him. He would not allow it. "Can you beat him?" Qin Hao rolled his eyes at Shi Dong. Shi Dong was speechless. This was the truth. He could not even beat Shi Lang. "But I can't let him talk about you like that. A straight foot is not afraid of a crooked shadow. Do whatever you want." Qin Hao did not care at all. "Let's eat first. Drink more of the medicinal bone soup your senior sister made today. You have an important mission later." "Mission?" Shi Dong did not understand and looked at Yin Qingqing. Yin Qingqing said blankly, "Why are you looking at me?" Shi Dong grinned and buried his head in eating. His master never told anyone in advance when he had something to do, so his senior sister obviously did not know. Yin Qingqing's culinary skills were exquisite. Coming from a commoner family, she had learned how to cook since young. This meal made Shi Dong praise it endlessly. Looking at the clean stacks of empty plates, to be honest, the disciples of the herb garden did have some advantages that the disciples of other dojos did not have. Every meal was very nutritious. However, it was not like what Shi Lang and Bian had said, where he had misappropriated a large amount of the Tao sect's resources. Usually, their meals consisted of herbs that Qin Hao had grown himself, and they were not herbs from the sect's herb garden. Although they didn't have the superb swordsmanship of the Sword Valley, the tyrannical martial arts of the Martial Pavilion, or the profound spells of the Spirit Pagoda, they had the most generous and selfless master in the world. After the meal, Qing cleaned up. Qin Hao and Shi Dong went to the courtyard and began to cultivate. Cultivating after meals had been a habit of theirs for the past few years. Qing did not complain about this. Although she would occasionally grumble, she was very clear about her own situation. Her martial arts would not be able to achieve great things. On the other hand, her master had put in so much effort to nurture Shi Dong. This proved that her junior brother was definitely outstanding in some way. "Master, what should I practice today?" Shi Dong asked. He had a vague feeling that Qin Hao's following standards would be very difficult. Martial veins, martial acupoints, qi si, spirit bones, qi harmonization, qi circulation, blood and flesh explosion. "Shi Dong, you should know these subtle mysteries of the body like the back of your hand. I'm an alchemist, so I'm not good at attacking. However, every body of flesh and blood contains power that cannot be ignored. What I can do is to teach you the subtle methods of softening the flesh and power." Qin Hao said. Shi Dong nodded seriously. Martial artists had always paid attention to talent, the grade of martial arts, and the divine soldier's weapon. It was easy for them to neglect the details of the body, which happened to be his master's specialty. Shi Dong had followed his master for nearly 3 years. He did not dare to say that he was very good at alchemy, but in terms of the body, he was indeed very familiar with it. When you entered the Taoist sect, I asked you to familiarize yourself with the various medicinal powers and understand the flesh and blood within 2 years. I did not ask you to practice any cultivation methods or martial arts. It was only in the past half a month that I began to let you out. Tell me, what did you learn? Qin Hao asked. It's very wonderful, Sherdong said longingly. Under the strict supervision of his master, he had tempered his physical body for 2 years. Every meridian, every spirit bone, when the vital qi circulated, that feeling was imprinted into his soul. However, he did not learn any martial arts. This was like a strong man who did not know how to throw a punch. He only had a strong physique, but he could not throw out the power he should have. However, in the past half a month, he had been cultivating in the spirit pagoda, the martial pavilion, and the military field. The power brought by the cultivation methods filled his body. It was very plentiful and enjoyable. Remember this feeling, but also forget it. Now, empty your mind and don't think about anything related to martial arts. Seriously search for the feeling of fullness in your body, and then try to see what kind of experience you will have. Qin Hao said, Okay. Sherdong nodded, sat cross-legged, and closed his eyes. It was as if he was in an uninhabited place and forgot everything related to martial arts. At this time, Qin Hao's eyes fell on Sherdong. The will of the emperor quietly penetrated Sherdong's soul, carefully feeling every subtle change in him. 2 years to familiarize himself with the body, and in a short time to experience the powerful pleasure brought by martial arts. Everything that Qin Hao had arranged was naturally reasonable. It was to pave the way for Sherdong to awaken his bloodline. Now, whether Sherdong could follow the wonderful feeling of fullness to awaken his bloodline depended on his own fortune. No, I can't do it. Sherdong opened his eyes and patted his face with both hands. Master said it was simple, but it was too difficult to do. The state of forgetting everything was impossible to enter. The common people have innate spirits. The innate power of some creatures will be in a closed state for some reason. This requires you to go back to the beginning and dig out the innate power. Do you know why Master wants you to do this? Qin Hao became a little serious. I have innate power. Sherdong was shocked. He understood immediately. Nodding, Qin Hao said, and it's a very strong innate power. You need to enter a state of nothingness to sense it, find it, and lead it back. Empty everything, forget everything, even your name, and try again. Okay, Sherdong was a little excited. He knew that Master would not lie to him. He had always thought that he was a low-level martial artist, but there was innate power hidden in his body. How could Sherdong not be excited about the powerful talent given by the heavenly Tao? Then what kind of power would his talent be? He closed his eyes again. Just like Qin Hao said, he had to empty everything and forget everything. Sherdong tried hard, but the more he tried, the easier it was for his mind to tense up. After a long time, he finally returned to his initial state. Taking a deep breath, Sherdong explored the state of nothingness that Qin Hao mentioned for the 3rd time. In his mind, it was as if he had stepped into a vast and endless world. There were no creatures in this world. He even imagined himself becoming a part of this world, merging with it, communicating with it, and searching for the truth. Time passed little by little. Sherdong's state became better and better. He was infinitely close to the state of nothingness that Qin Hao mentioned. He gradually discovered that his master's state of nothingness was too profound and mysterious. It seemed to be nothingness, but in reality there was. Everything was void, but in the void there was the truth of the great Tao. He could even feel the wind, the cold, the flames, the mountains, the rivers, and many other things that seemed to be non-existent, but actually existed in this world of nothingness. Good comprehension. Qin Hao's emperors will silently invaded Sherdong's mind power. What the other could feel, he could also feel. The descendant of senior brother Shirmu was indeed very talented in martial arts. If Sherdong could comprehend the general trend of the world in the state of nothingness, then he would not be far from the great Tao of Emperor. Of course, it was impossible for him to break through to the great Tao of Emperor, but at least after comprehending it, he would lay a foundation for the great Tao of Emperor in the future. Once his cultivation caught up, it would be much easier for Dong to enter the great Tao of Emperor. Chapter 1652. As time passed, Dong's state of nothingness became more and more stable. He had truly reached the state of selflessness, and his soul seemed to have turned into nothingness. His spirit swam freely in the world of nothingness, as if he had touched a kind of will. At this moment, a strange feeling also appeared in his body. A power that did not exist gradually condensed from nothingness into existence. The aura was weak, but Hao could feel that this power was real. When a martial artist forgot everything, when his spirit returned to the beginning of his life, he could get closer to the Tao. There were 3,000 great Taos, including the way of man, the way of martial arts, the way of the saints, the way of life and death, and the way of the emperor. They were all derived from the great Taos, and the power they gave people was completely different. Only the power of the heavenly way was supreme. Hao could not see what the heavenly way was, but at this moment, when his emperor will invaded Dong's mind power, he vaguely had a new understanding of the great Taos. Dong is addicted, he murmured. Hao murmured softly. Although his spirit resonated with Dong, he did not forget his goal. The disciple could be confused, but the master had to be clear-headed. Dong had sunk into the 3,000 great paths and could not find his own path. If this continued, his bloodline would not be able to awaken. He had to create some pressure to force out his potential. With this in mind, Hao's emperor will move slightly. In an instant, in Dong's spiritual world, the wind and clouds suddenly changed, as if there was a great Tao power forcefully reversing the universe. The world suddenly collapsed, the heavens and the earth rumbled, and the mountains and rivers below shattered. This sudden and terrifying scene immediately disturbed Dong. He felt that his spiritual world was collapsing. After all, his mind power had merged with nothingness. The blood in his body flowed backward, and his aura became chaotic. Dong's face was severely distorted, and his expression was pained. Blood flowed out of his nostrils, eyes, and ears as if he had suffered a terrible injury. "Master!" Qingqing screamed when she saw this scene. She did not understand why this was happening. Didn't he say he was cultivating? Sigh. Hao sighed inwardly. He had failed and could not continue. Otherwise, Dong would not be able to withstand the pressure of his emperor will. Once his spirit completely collapsed, he would become an idiot. Dispersing the emperor will, Hao stepped forward and pushed Dong's body. Dong was awakened, his face pale. Cultivation complete. Hao said. There was a trace of bleakness in his eyes. It seemed that it would not be easy to awaken the power of Dong's bloodline. "Master, have I disappointed you?" Dong could sense Hao's emotions, but he had already tried his best. "It was too difficult. I'm not disappointed. Otherwise, I wouldn't have accepted you as my disciple. You have a long way to go. Xiao Yuan Shi, go back and wash yourself." Hao consoled. After saying that, he walked back into the room. Dong lowered his head to look at himself. There was a lot of dirt seeping out of his clothes, and his body gave off a strange smell. He said sullenly to Qingqing, "I must have made him unhappy. Hurry up and wash yourself. You're going to die from the stench." Qingqing covered her nose and left. Dong was bleeding from all 7 orifices. It scared her to death. In the pharmacy, Hao looked at Dong's receding figure with a helpless expression. Even though he was Dindi of the East Continent and had extraordinary medical skills, he could not awaken his disciple's bloodline. Senior brother Mu had really given him a difficult problem. At this moment, Hao thought of Miyori. If senior sister was still alive, she could use the flawless Dilly to guide Dong. Perhaps it would be easier to awaken Dong's bloodline. Unfortunately, senior sister had passed away for 5 years. Time flew by. In the blink of an eye, another 3 years had passed. It had been 8 years since Qin Hao came to the Taoist sect. During these 8 years, he focused on cultivating and teaching disciples in the southern heavens. However, he did not hear any news about Shaohan. He did not know how everyone was doing. Similarly, he had not contacted Western Liang for 8 years. Were Xiaoguo and Xuehan doing well? As for his father-in-law, he hoped that Xiao Yi would not be too worried. During these 8 years, Qin Hao tried almost all methods to help Shi Dong awaken his bloodline, but he failed again and again. However, he did not give up, nor could he give up. Since he had promised to take care of the Taoist sect on behalf of his senior brother, he had to teach a genius comparable to the descendant of an overlord force for the Taoist sect in the future. Shi Dong was his best choice. While teaching disciples, Qin Hao did not neglect his own cultivation during these 8 years. He continued to use the five-spirit earth qi of the southern heavens peak to constantly temper his Tao, making his emperor intent laws more and more perfect. However, as his Tao confirming power increased by one layer, the growth of his realm slowed down. It was not that Qin Hao did not have enough comprehension of the emperor's Tao, but that it was very difficult to hone it. It was not easy to become a flawless emperor. The last time he had broken through was 3 years ago. Now, Qin Hao had not broken through to the 8th layer of the Tao confirming realm. However, he vaguely felt that he would soon break through. After the 8th layer, he would break through one more layer and become a Tao confirming emperor. In contrast, the progress of his two disciples was very obvious, especially Shi Dong. He had grown by leaps and bounds and had broken through to the 4th layer of the profound sage realm. He was only 2 layers away from surpassing his master. After all, on the surface, Qin Hao was acting as a 6th layer profound sage alchemist in the Taoist sect. The only pity was that Shi Dong's bloodline had not awakened. Qin's realm was 1 level higher than Shi Dong's, but if they fought, she would not be Shi Dong's opponent. Although his bloodline had not awakened, his physical body had been tempered to the extreme by Qin Hao. He could be called a humanoid monster. The matter of the martial pavilion 3 years ago had caused a lot of waves in the Taoist sect. Shi Dong's rapid growth made the Taoist sect feel incredulous. Later, Bo Sameo reported to the upper echelons that the inner sect had sent people to investigate. Of course, it was not to investigate Qin Hao's theft of precious herbs. The herb garden was supervised by Elder Yu. Elder Yu was a person of virtue and prestige and was an old minister of the Taoist sect. The 3 sect masters naturally trusted the person he appointed. This investigation was directed at Shi Dong. Elder Qi suspected that there was a mistake in Shi Dong's aptitude test. Logically speaking, it was impossible for him to step into the sage realm. However, no matter how the inner sect investigated, it was obvious that they could not find anything. Qin Hao vaguely dealt with all of them, and the matter was left unsettled. In the end, the upper echelons of the Taoist sect slowly got used to Qin Hao's excuses, even if they did not match up. As for Shi Dong, he had successfully attracted the attention of the Taoist sect and was appointed as a disciple of the inner sect. He had the same status as Baiyan, Shi Lang, and Bo Minghua. Qin Hao had expected such a result. In the world of martial arts, strength was the prerequisite to being respected. No matter what Shi Dong's aptitude was, since he had entered the sage realm and become one of the most outstanding disciples of the Taoist sect, he would naturally be valued by the sect. In the mountains to the north of Nanjiang City, ancient trees formed a forest. Demonic qi was rampant, and tyrannical great demons often appeared. In the mountains, there was a mine vein controlled by the city lord's mansion. It produced rare and precious ores that could be used to forge an extraordinary divine soldier. However, today, a major event happened here. The mine collapsed, and countless miners were killed or injured. Even the supervision camp set up by the city lord's mansion was buried in it. Only a few martial artists with powerful cultivation were lucky enough to escape. They were so scared that they almost lost their minds. This was because below the mine was a huge cemetery. In the center of the cemetery, there was an ominous tomb, the Emperor's tomb. Chapter 1653. The appearance of the great emperor's tomb shook the entire Nanjiang city. Even the surrounding areas were alarmed. Many sect forces wanted to send people into the graveyard to take a look at the solemn great emperor's tomb in search for treasures of great value. Although they knew that the great emperor's tomb was dangerous, this couldn't stop the powerhouses of the various sect forces. At this time, in the sky above the mountains in the north of Nanjiang City, there were cultivators from 3 forces moving in the air. Although they were far away, they were all moving very quickly towards the graveyard. Taisui Mountain, Striking Sky Sect, and Qilindao Sect were the 3 major sects surrounding Nanjiang City. Naturally, they couldn't let outsiders take the lead. They had to enter the graveyard as soon as possible and obtain the treasures of the great emperor's tomb. Everyone, don't let your guard down. After entering, be prepared to deal with anything at any time. Bo Sameo cautioned them carefully as purple essence surged around him. This time, he was traveling with Shi Qing and Shi Jinhua to lead the elite disciples of the Dao sect to explore the great emperor's tomb. I naturally have the ability to deal with all dangers and can take care of the disciples of the Sword Valley. You should worry about the others. Shi Jinhua glanced behind him, then immediately looked away. The 3 of them were enough to lead the disciples of the Dao sect on this trip, but Qin Hao had come along. What was the use of a profound sage alchemist? If there was danger, you wouldn't be able to take care of Qin Hao. It's not just the Sword Valley. Everyone here is a disciple of the Dao sect. We have a responsibility to bring everyone back safely. Shi Qing said, "Don't worry, I will do my best. You, on the other hand, must pay attention to your personal safety." Shi Jinhua smiled. Bo Sameo shook his head slightly and looked behind at Qin Hao sympathetically. The latter smiled faintly without a trace of worry on his face. The mine graveyard was very strange. It seemed to be affected by a powerful force. The higher one's martial cultivation, the easier it was to be restricted. Human sovereigns and high-level Yuan venerates couldn't enter at all. Only lower-level Yuan venerates could barely enter and not be isolated by the power of the graveyard. Otherwise, the 3 sect masters of the Dao sect would have come personally to lead the team today. Unfortunately, the 3 sect masters had tried. The Taisui Monarch and the striking Dao Emperor couldn't enter either. Therefore, Shi Qing and the other 2 were arranged to lead the team. Of course, the Taoist sect was not the only one that was sent to explore the cemetery today. The Void Striking sect and the Taisui Mountain had also sent out their elite disciples and elders. It seemed that the upper echelons of the 3 sects had secretly discussed that each sect would send out the same number of disciples, so that no one would have too much of an advantage. Even so, once they entered the cemetery, friction was inevitable. After all, they were all aiming for the treasures. As for the final result, it would depend on their own methods. Actually, Qin Hao didn't have to come. He was worried about Shi Dong and Qing Qing, so he asked to come along. Shi Dong and Qing Qing were appointed as the elite disciples of the cabinet. They were responsible for entering the cemetery on behalf of Haoyan Taoism. Moreover, Shi Mu was the only descendant of his senior brother. Qin Hao would never allow anything to happen to him. As for whether or not he could enter the tomb, Qin Hao wasn't worried at all. He scanned the tomb with his emperor's will and found that the power that sealed the tomb was very weak. Obviously, Emperor Yuan, who was buried inside, had a cultivation level far lower than his. It wasn't a problem for him to block a human sovereign, but how could he block Qin Hao, who was comparable to a Dao emperor? If he entered the tomb, it would be in no man's land. However, for the 3 sects of Nanjiang City, as well as many other sects, the emperor was so high and mighty. Anything left behind by the emperor during his lifetime would be regarded as a treasure and would be fought over. The 3 lower-level Yuan venerates led the team forward. Soon, the team arrived at the location. After everyone landed, they found that the powerhouses of Taisui Mountain and Voidstrike sect had already arrived. They were standing at the entrance of the cemetery, as if waiting for the Dao sect team to arrive. After all, today's exploration of the tomb was agreed upon by the upper echelons of the 3 sections. It couldn't be broken. Elder Shi Qing, you are here. An outstanding young elder of the Void Strike sect stepped forward and greeted them. Qin Hao looked over and saw that it was Elder Wu, Lu Guang's master. Yes. Sure, Qing nodded. Sorry to have kept everyone waiting. Haha, it's all right. Actually, we just arrived. A large number of martialists in golden robes came over from another position. Among them, a particularly tall young man laughed loudly. He was obviously the leader of the Taisui Mountain team this time. Elder Shi Qing, Elder Song, the tomb is full of dangers. What do the two of you think? Do you want to team up with the Void Strike sect? Elder Wu smiled. It is precisely because it is full of dangers that it is the best place to test the disciples. There's no need for us to go together. Elder Song of Taisui Mountain said with a sharp glint in his eyes. Team up? He couldn't trust this person surnamed Wu. The same goes for the Dao sect, Shi Qing said politely. Clearly, he wasn't willing to travel with the Void Strike sect. Who would the treasures belong to if they found them? My master has good intentions. I was afraid that you wouldn't appreciate it, yet you actually don't appreciate it. Haha. Lu Guang advises the disciples of the two sects that if you don't have a certain degree of confidence in your own strength, you shouldn't go in and throw your lives away. Why don't you return to where you came from? Said a dignified disciple beside Elder Wu. It had been 6 years since the Nanjiang City examination ceremony. Lu Guang was now in his early 20s, and his temperament was even more extraordinary. Moreover, the aura of a genius gave off an invisible pressure. Even when facing the elders of Taoism and Taisui Mountain, he was still very tough, and his aura was not inferior at all. You're right. If you don't have a certain degree of confidence in your own strength, it's better not to go in. That's why the disciples of the Taisui Mountain want to go in. We have absolute confidence. At that moment, a young man among the disciples of the Taisui Mountain stood out. Although he was wearing a noble golden robe like the other disciples, this disciple had a black jade belt around his waist. His eyes were bright, and he gave off a natural superior aura. The other disciples also had a white jade belt around their waist. Moreover, they looked at this young man with eyes full of admiration. Dui Tianchong, the grandson of the old master of the Taisui Mountain and the son of the Taisui Emperor, was known to be unparalleled in the Nanjiang region. His extraordinary aura was not inferior to Lu Guang's. With the appearance of Dui Tianchong, whether it was the disciples of the Dao sect or the Void Strike sect, they all felt a sense of pressure. However, the Void Strike sect had an arrogant genius like Lu Guang at the front, so they were not afraid of the son of the Taisui Emperor. In contrast, the disciples of the Dao sect could not raise their heads. Shirlang, who was known as the #1 in the Sword Valley, felt a sense of shame the moment he faced Lu Guang and Dui Tianchong. He did not dare to look at the two of them directly for fear of attracting their attention. He said, "In that case, I think the two of you can go back on the spot. With me around, the Dao sect has no room for you to show off." At that moment, Tao Wu stepped out and stood proudly in front of Lu Guang and Dui Tianchong. In an instant, the aura of the three geniuses was released at the same time. An incomparably sharp aura seemed to collide invisibly. Tao Wu. The disciples of the Dao sect were delighted. Tao Wu was right. He was not as unbearable as Lu Guang and Dui Tianchong thought. "What's your name?" Lu Guang's gaze was sharp as he stared at Tao Wu. Tao Wu. Tao Wu raised his head proudly and answered, "Hee, you're very arrogant. I just don't know if your strength is as big as your words." Lu Guang said in a low voice. His eyes flashed with fighting spirit, and he was slightly excited. "You'll see if I'm capable or not very soon." Tao Wu said fearlessly and glanced at Dui Tianchong. He had long wanted to learn a few moves from the son of the Taisui Emperor. Chapter 1654. Dui Tianchong sized up Tao Wu with a calm expression. He had heard of the name of Taoism's Swan and I. Even though he was not a direct descendant of the Swan and I, he had displayed extraordinary talent since he was young and was favored by Elder Swan Qing. However, Tao was only outstanding in Tao sect, and Dui Tianchong did not take him seriously. "See you at the cemetery." Lu Guang's tone was slightly threatening. If there was a chance, he looked forward to competing with Tao Wu. At this moment, the higher-ups of the three sects were looking at their most outstanding juniors. Before entering the tomb, they had already ignited the flames of war. There would definitely be an extremely intense competition between the three of them in the future. All right, today's main purpose is to explore the tomb. If you have the energy to quarrel, why don't you stay at the cemetery? Elder Wu said. Then, he looked at Chu Qing and Elder Song and said, since the three sects are here, let's enter as soon as possible. If we delay any longer, it will be disadvantageous to us. That's right, let's enter the cemetery. Elder Song strode forward and led the disciples of Tai Sui Mountain forward. Chu Qing and Bosameo looked at each other and followed. Now that the mine had collapsed, a vast and endless sinkhole had appeared in front of them. That area was mysterious and full of danger. It was the target of the exploration. The teams of the three sects advanced at the same time and tacitly kept a distance from each other. At this moment, in the Tao sect team, Shi Dong was following beside Qin Hao. He appeared to be very quiet and did not attract anyone's attention. Although his martial arts realm had improved rapidly in recent years, he was still no match for Shi Lang and Tao Wu in Tao sect. How could he attract the attention of the other two sects? Lu Guang and Dui Tianchong were very proud. They did not even look at the other disciples of Tao sect. It seemed that in Tao sect, only Tao Wu could barely fight with them. Feeling the pressure? Qin Hao asked in a low voice. Just now, Shi Dong was very low-key. Although he did not say anything, his gaze was fixed on Dui Tianchong and Lu Guang. His expression was somewhat complicated. It seemed to be envy, but also a desire to fight. Yes, Lu Guang, Dui Tianchong, and Tao Wu are all very strong. Shi Dong answered honestly. If you meet them at the cemetery, do you have the confidence to fight them? Qin Hao smiled and transmitted his voice. I may not be a match for them. Shi Dong smiled foolishly. You're humble. Qin Hao could tell from Shi Dong's words that he might not be a match for him. But there was another possibility. In all fairness, Shi Dongdi did not have the advantage in a direct confrontation. His foundation was weak, and he started late. On the other hand, Dui Tianchong and Bayan grew up with a golden spoon in their mouths. In terms of martial arts, they did not lack anything since they were young. On the other hand, Lu Guang's bloodline talent was extremely strong. He was born with twin souls, and his mentality was as high as rank 15. In the past 6 years, even though Qin Hao had used medicinal pills to speed up Shi Dong's cultivation, he still could not match Lu Guang's speed of growth. Therefore, facing these three people, it was very difficult for Shi Dong to gain an advantage. However, it was not that much weaker. These years, Qin Hao had not taught Shi Dong for nothing. Shi Dong's physical strength had been honed to a terrifying degree. His only regret was that he did not have a source spirit talent. Qin Hao laughed. That would definitely be a different kind of scenery. Perhaps the three of them might not be able to take advantage of the situation even if they joined forces. The mine was very deep. After it collapsed, it formed a vast pit. The teams of the three sects walked for a long time before they could truly enter the cemetery area. In an instant, an invisible pressure swept over. As far as the eye could see, the world was gray and hazy. Within the pit, wisps of gray fog drifted, obscuring one's vision and preventing them from seeing the full picture of the cemetery. It was exceptionally stifling. Furthermore, as soon as they stood there, everyone could feel a strong, deathly aura emanating from the space. An unpleasant, rancid smell spread from the bottom of their feet. The combination of the rancid smell and the deathly aura was nauseating. Just as Sectmaster said, there is a terrifying force suppressing this cemetery area. At the moment, Shi Jinhua's cheeks were sweating profusely. His body was very tense. He could feel that his Yuan Qi was being suppressed by the power of the cemetery and was constantly weakening. His cultivation base did not regress, but his aura was constantly weakening. It was not just Shi Jinhua. The Dao sects Piao Qing, Bosameo, Elder Song of the Tai Sui Mountain, and Elder Wu of the Striking Void sect were also in the same situation. Their Yuan venerate powers were greatly affected, so they might not even be able to display 40% of their abilities in the outside world. Furthermore, their powers continued to weaken. On the other hand, the disciples of the three sects did not seem to have any abnormalities. No wonder Tao emperors can't enter this place. Everyone, hurry up. We will go east. If we are lucky, we can still meet in the central region of the Archtomb. I hope you will still be alive by then. After Elder Wu finished speaking, he led the disciples of the Striking Void sect forward quickly and quickly disappeared from sight. There was a terrifying force suppressing the cemetery. The deathly aura was dense, and the rancid smell coming from underground made one's heart palpitate. No one knew what dangers would emerge from this place. Elder Wu's power continued to weaken, and no one knew how much of his power he could retain in the end. They had to speed up, obtain useful things, and then leave safely with the disciples. As he spoke, Elder Song led the people of the Tai Sui Mountain and left through the western region without saying goodbye. He seemed to be in a hurry. Even he knew that the longer they stayed in the cemetery, the more dangerous their lives would be. Let's go. Shi Jinhua waved his hand, and the people of the Dao sect advanced straight ahead. The three sects went in different directions and instantly lost contact. This was good too. At least there wouldn't be any disputes if they encountered treasures along the way. As for who could reach the central region of the Archtomb, it would depend on their own abilities. In the vast cemetery, gray fog lingered like a haze. The three teams entered and soon disappeared. But no matter which sect they were from, they all flew towards the Archtomb at an extremely fast speed. Dong, Qing, follow me closely. Qin Hao urged. This cemetery was indeed very oppressive. The rancid smell underground made him very uncomfortable. This kind of thing was definitely not for decoration. However, Qin Hao didn't feel any sense of crisis. As he expected, Emperor Yuan, who was buried in the cemetery, had a lower cultivation level than him. The power suppressing this place clearly belonged to the laws of the Emperor's will. He couldn't break through to the human sovereign realm, so it didn't have any effect on Qin Hao. As for why he felt uncomfortable, it was probably related to cultivation. Emperor Yuan, who died here, seemed to have cultivated the Emperor's path very differently. After some time, suddenly, the sound of a fierce battle came from the east and west, mixed with the frightened shouts of disciples. The sound was very clear. The sound came through the fog. The Tai Sui Mountain and the Void Strike sect were obviously in trouble. Immediately, the disciples of the Dao sect became vigilant. Many people subconsciously pulled out their sharp swords. Their minds were highly tense. Pairs of anxious eyes stared at the gray fog, fearing that some monsters would appear. Don't be nervous. Follow me, Shi Jinhua said. He slowed down, not daring to continue to force his way through. After all, there was an emperor buried in the cemetery. Junior brothers, relax. With Master and the elders here, it'll be fine. Shi Lang cooperated. At this moment, he was also gloating. The people of the Tai Sui Mountain and the Void Strike sect seemed to have encountered something. Hearing the screams, they seemed to be frightened. They could only blame themselves for being unlucky. The Dao sect was much quieter. Something seemed to be grabbing his leg. Shi Lang's heel suddenly froze in place. He couldn't move. At this moment, he turned around and looked down. The moment his gaze fell, his eyes suddenly widened. His mouth opened so wide that a fist could be stuffed in. His throat was dry. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't make any sound for a while. It wasn't until 2 seconds later that an earth-shattering scream shook the air. Sword light suddenly burst out from Shi Lang's hand. With the sword mark in his hand, it was mixed with turbulent sword energy. He stabbed it vertically into the ground. The thing that grabbed his leg was a pair of pale hands. Shi Lang saw half of a head emerging from the soil. It was incomparably ugly. Its facial features were rotten like a ghost. Although martial artists were bold and often faced death, they still couldn't help but be frightened when they suddenly saw such a thing, especially when the head was rotten and bloody. The hands that grabbed Shi Lang's leg were extremely strong. It couldn't be explained by common sense at all. Panic immediately swept through his heart and spread to his soul. Almost instinctively, he erupted with all his strength and stabbed it. No matter what it was, in short, it was enough to stab it to death. Chapter 1655. A dazzling radiance burst forth from the sword mark as it pierced into the soil. Sword chi wreaked havoc, and smelly blood splattered everywhere. This strike completely destroyed the rotten corpse buried below. The ground within a radius of more than 10 meters was also cut into countless sword marks. The broken head was separated from the dismembered corpse. As the sword mark was pulled out, it flicked Shi Lang's face. The tongue rolled out from the damaged mouth. The worm-stained eyes drooped from the eye sockets, and the head was connected to pitch-black blood vessels. The stench was simply maddening and suffocating. Shi Lang was scared out of his wits. He retreated awkwardly and fell to the ground with a frightened expression. He didn't consider the consequences and didn't have time to care about his fellow disciples. He only knew that he would destroy everything with a single strike. The devastating sword chi almost accidentally injured the bystanders. "Why are you panicking?" Shi Jinhua walked over and lifted Shi Lang from the ground. It was just a rotten corpse, but he didn't seem frightened at all. "I'm sorry, master." Shi Lang's lips trembled as he suppressed the fear in his heart. Perhaps because of the sword chi, pale palms kept reaching out and pushing away the soil. A large number of rotten corpses began to crawl out, and the number was increasing. When Shi Jinhua saw this, he stomped on the ground. Immediately, a layer of turbulent essence, chi, burst forth from the soles of his feet and swept out like a gust of wind, destroying all the rotten corpses. Do you see that? They can't even withstand a single blow. Ordinary people can also be killed easily. Maintain the formation and continue moving forward, Shi Jinhua ordered. He realized that the essence chi in his body had weakened significantly with this stomp. It no longer had the lethality of a Yuan venerate and was about the same as a high-level Yuan monarch. This wasn't a place to stay for long. The disciples of the Dao sect leaned on each other and tightened their formation as they continued to move forward. Along the way, there were constantly dead spirits emerging from the ground, but they were easily destroyed by the disciples. These rotten corpses only had frightening faces. At first glance, one's vision wasn't restricted, but they didn't pose much of a threat. At most, they were slightly stronger than ordinary people, but they couldn't hinder the progress of the cultivators. Slowly, everyone got used to it and began to enjoy killing spirits, treating it as a form of cultivation. Qin had also killed some dead spirits. However, he realized that the situation was not as optimistic as it seemed. The deeper he went into the cemetery, the stronger the defense of the dead spirits and their physiques became. If the dead spirits that were killed in the periphery were stronger than ordinary people, now the disciples of the Dao sect had to release stronger vital qi to kill them in one strike. It could be predicted that the situation and the dead spirits. This wasn't the worst. There was another problem that was more important. The disciples had limited stamina and vitality, but the dead spirits didn't fear death and didn't know fatigue. They constantly came out and interfered with the group's progress. The living would sooner or later collapse from exhaustion. Just as Qin Hao had predicted, after walking for about half a day, the situation became worse. The disciples could no longer feel the thrill of killing the dead souls. They gradually became numb, tired, and exhausted. Their physical strength and Yuan Qi were rapidly depleting. Including Shi Jinhua and the other two, their condition was not as good as when they had just entered the graveyard. Many disciples with weaker cultivation were about to lose their strength to continue fighting. I think the team should be split into 2 or 3 groups. Let's go in different directions. Shi Jinhua held a sharp sword in his hand. Sword light swept across and cut a skeleton into pieces. As early as 4 hours ago, he had stopped using Yuan Qi and switched to using a weapon. The others were the same. Because there were too many dead spirits, they had to preserve their essence Qi. Moreover, Sure Jinhua had a feeling that the more living people gathered, the more dead spirits they would attract. To reduce the pressure, they should disperse the aura of the living people. I believe you can feel it too. The dead spirits are attracted by the aura of the living. I suggest that Shi Qing and I lead a group of disciples. Sameo, you and Qin Hao go together. This way, we will have a better chance to go deeper and reach the Emperor's tomb before Tai Sui Mountain and void-striking sect. Shi Jinhua said. He looked at Shi Qing. It would be better if he could deepen his relationship with Shi Qing today. I don't agree. Shi Qing said. If the team is split, our strength will be divided. You, me, and Sameo all have the ability to protect ourselves. What about the disciples? Not only that, her beautiful eyes glanced at Qin Hao as she continued. Qin Hao's cultivation isn't that much stronger than the other disciples. Sameo alone has to bear more pressure. Bo Sameo nodded. He agreed with what Shi Qing said. It was not that they despised Qin Hao's low cultivation. It was just that there was a great risk in splitting the team. After all, in the endless graveyard, not only were there endless dead spirits, there were also people from Tai Sui Mountain and void-striking sect. Once they split up, it would be even more troublesome if they bumped into them. What can you do? Shi Jinhua's suggestion was not accepted. He looked at Qin Hao coldly. If he knew it would be like this, he would have asked the other elders to come. Any one of the outer elders would be better than this alchemist. Sorry, it seems like I have become a burden. Qin Hao ignored Shi Jinhua and said to the other two, let's not be calculative at a time like this. After all, even the 3 sect masters don't know the specific situation inside the graveyard. Shi Qing's tone was somewhat helpless. Perhaps they shouldn't have come. After all, a Thearch's tomb was the last place where a Thearch's dignity was buried. How could it be invaded wantonly? Boom! Shi Qing had just said this when a loud explosion was heard from the front. The disciples could see through the hazy fog that there was a huge tombstone with inscriptions. Obviously, this huge tomb was much bigger than the small mounds of earth where the dead spirits were buried. Perhaps a powerhouse was buried in this huge tomb. At that moment, as the tombstone exploded, a pitch-black figure clad in broken armor slowly stood up. It was very tall and was riding a ferocious beast mount made of bones. Suddenly, a terrifying and dangerous aura surged over. Shi Jinhua, Shi Qing, and Bo Sameo exclaimed at the same time when they saw this figure. Yuan Venerate. Although it was dead, the deathly aura it exuded was indeed that of a Yuan Venerate powerhouse. Furthermore, it was a high-level Yuan Venerate. Even if they were in the outside world, they definitely wouldn't be a match for it, let alone in the graveyard where the cultivation bases of Shi Qing and the others were suppressed. This was really troublesome. Let's go quickly. Shi Jinhua became extremely nervous in an instant. A high-level undead spirit wasn't something he could fight against. Even Shi Qing and Bo Sameo wouldn't be able to do so. Unfortunately, they couldn't escape. The undead powerhouse riding the ferocious skeletal beast seemed to have a life of its own as it slowly unsheathed the sword at its waist. Under the armor, a strange shriek was heard. It sounded like a general giving orders on the battlefield when it was still alive. As soon as it gave the order, countless undead warriors riding small ferocious skeletal beasts climbed out from behind it. They held halberds in their hands as they lined up in a formation and charged toward the disciples. Rumble! The ground ahead shook as if an army was advancing. The overwhelming killing intent made the disciples' scalps go numb. They had never seen such a battle before. However, the path was blocked. If they wanted to break through, they would have to face this undead army. Chapter 1656. The hearts of the Taoist disciples were beating violently. Under the pressure of the battle formation, they felt as if their breathing was about to stop. Before they set off, they knew that the tomb was dangerous and had thought of 100 kinds of risks. They were also prepared to fight with the Tai Sui Mountain and the airstrike sect, but they never expected to encounter such a situation. The undead army surged forward like a tide. The tattered corpses did not know what fear was. They only knew how to devour everything. However, Even if a living person could be killed with a sword, these corpses would still continue to attack, even if their heads were cut off and their bodies were cut in half. Unless they were completely destroyed, they would still stab their rusty blades into the bodies of the Taoist disciples, even if they were only left with a crippled hand. How can there be such things that can't be killed? The number is so shocking. It shouldn't be. It's over. Everyone might not be able to leave after this trip. The disciples were in despair. This was the first time they realized that death was so close to them. It turned out that living was so wonderful. Of course, there are also some people with strong wills and strong beliefs. They were not frightened by the undead. Among the disciples, there was one person who was running as if he was flying. Flames raged all over his body. When he ran, he was like a fierce Chelan. He directly charged towards the undead army. Xuanxiu let out a low roar. He gathered soul fire in his palms and blasted it out continuously. Wherever he passed, the undead army collapsed and was unstoppable. He was not the only one. Besides Xuanxiu, Sherdong held a sharp sword. His vital qi covered the blade with a layer of orange radiance. The holy light wreaked havoc, and batch after batch of undead fell under the sword light. Sameo, Shi Jinhua, and Bo Sameo looked at each other. The two of them rose into the air and directly flew over the undead army. They charged towards the undead general riding on the skeleton. The undead general seemed to have retained a trace of its will and was commanding the battle. If it was not stopped, the disciples would not be able to pass through safely. Chu San, take the disciples and leave first. At this time, Shi also made her move. Vital qi surged around her body as she caught up with Shi Jinhua and Bo Sameo. The three of them formed seals, and beams of light continuously blasted towards the undead general's head. No matter what, they had to withstand it. All of you follow me. Qin Hao knew that the situation was critical. He looked around and quickly found the weakness of the undead army. He grabbed Yin Qingqing with one hand and used his other hand to continuously release a profound sage-level Yuan Qi. He led all the disciples of the Taoism sect and stabbed into the undead army like a sharp dagger. They were like a hot knife cutting through butter as they charged forward quickly. At this moment, Shi Jinhua and the other two had joined forces to besiege the dead spirit warrior. The battle was exceptionally fierce. Qin Hao's mission was to buy time and bring the disciples out of danger as soon as possible. This was a battle of time. If Shi Qing and the other two could not escape before they were defeated, everyone would stay here forever and become part of the graveyard. 2. The disciples of Dao's sect were very tense. With Qin Hao leading the team and Sherdong and the Bayan protecting them on both sides, they advanced in extremely fast speed. In fact, other than the fact that the undead battle generals were a little frightening, the ordinary undead spirits were not too strong. In a few dozen breaths, they would safely break through the blockade. Boom! At this time, there was a sudden explosion. Not far away, a huge stone tablet exploded. In the fog, a tall figure wearing broken armor stood out. In the desperate eyes of the disciples, he slowly raised his broken sword. On the broken sword, there was a strong death aura mixed with the radiance, and it slashed down. The second undead general. Be careful. Bo Sameo saw it. He moved down. Just as the sword was about to slash down, a ball of yin and yang light rose from his palms and blocked the sword. Qi! With an ear-piercing, slicing sound, the yin-yang radiance was split apart. Although the sword qi was weakened, Bo Sameo still spat out a mouthful of blood. His body was in turmoil, and he was almost knocked to the ground by the sword qi. Elder Bo, the disciples were shocked. Was the undead general this strong? The elder of the martial pavilion could not even block a sword. Li Chuji, what can you do? High up in the sky, Shi Jinhua's hysterical screams could be heard. Seeing that the second undead general had heavily injured Bo Sameo, Shi Jinhua actually grabbed Shi Qing and ignored her resistance. The flying light flew into the distance until it completely disappeared in the haze. At this moment, the space seemed to be silent. All the disciples, including Shi Lang of the Sword Valley, looked at the haze in disbelief. Did his respected master just escape? As an elder of the Tao sect, he did not care about the lives of his disciples and the injuries of his fellow disciples. The hearts of the disciples of the Tao sect were cold. "Sameo, how are you?" Qin Hao walked over and saw that Bo Sameo's 2 sleeves had been torn apart, and his arms were bleeding profusely. There was even a rotten stench of death qi seeping into his wounds. "I feel terrible. Chu-san, don't worry about me. Take the disciples and escape. I still have strength. I can buy you some time." At this moment, Bo Sameo's face was frighteningly pale. It was not the kind of paleness caused by blood loss. Instead, it was as if he had turned into a corpse. His aura was very chaotic. Blood vessels appeared in his eyes. The blood vessels crawled like worms. His painful expression was filled with a bloodthirsty madness. It was as if he would go crazy in the next second. "Form the Tao formation," Qin Hao shouted. What was the point of running at this time? Obviously, he could see that Bo Sameo's condition was very bad. If he was not treated in time, he would soon become the 3rd undead general. If that really happened, Qin Hao would not be able to save him. He could only kill him. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Balls of flames flickered. They were of different strengths. There were saints and high-level sky grandmasters. Elder Bo was severely injured, and the elder of the Sword Valley, Shi Jinhua, had abandoned everyone and escaped. But no matter what, they had to fight to survive. According to Qin Hao's instructions, they formed the Tao formation and tried to open a ray of light from the cracks of death. Shi Jinhua is really a jerk. Soul fire gathered in Swan Shio's palms. He gnashed his teeth in hatred. If he escaped, then so be it. How could he forcibly take his aunt away? If he could return alive, he would not forgive him. Hearing Swan Shio insulting Shi Jinhua, Shi Lang was about to speak. He opened his mouth, but swallowed his words. He touched his conscience and said, "My master is really a jerk. He even abandoned his beloved disciple. If you want to leave, please take Shi Lang with you. Eat this." Qin Hao took out a pill and put it in Bo Sameo's mouth. He instructed Qing to take care of him. Then, standing under the light of the formation, his gaze seemed to penetrate the boundary and see the undead army and the 2 undead generals. At this moment, the undead army was like a black mass of ants. Disgusting green liquid flowed from their rotten mouths, and their twisted limbs crawled all over the boundary. The deformed weapons in their hands were constantly slashing at the boundary. Although many of their kind were killed, they did not stop for a moment. Along with this, the Tao formation that gathered the power of all the disciples was constantly being weakened. Obviously, it would not be able to last for long. It seemed that he had no choice but to take action. Emperor Yuan, who is good at the path of undead. Interesting. Qin Hao sneered in his heart. The cemetery was full of undead. They were obviously driven by some kind of will to attack the living. But it was definitely not the 2 undead generals who were driving them. The cultivation of a 9th level Yuan Venerate was limited. Once a cultivator's physical body died, their divine soul would not last long before dissipating. The only existence that could drive so many undead was Emperor Yuan, who controlled the power of laws. The guy buried in the tomb was most likely not completely dead. Chapter 1657. Master, what should we do? Shi Dong raised his palms above his head as his sacred power continuously poured into the formation light. The pressure from above was getting stronger and stronger, and the formation would break at any time. Qin Hao took out 2 talismans from his sleeve and handed them to Shi Dong. Elder Qi gave them to me before we set off. They should be useful. Why didn't you take them out earlier? Bayan reprimanded and reached out to grab one. Elder Qi of the inner sect was proficient in talisman techniques and was at the 8th level Yuan Venerate. It might not be effective against the undead battle generals, but it was more than enough to blast open a way out. Bayan did not suspect anything. The talismans must have been inscribed by Elder Qi. He was only worried about how many people could escape. There were too many undead spirits, so it was impossible for all the disciples to escape safely. It all depended on their luck. The formation light continued to weaken as countless rotting corpses piled up like mountains of corpses in the void. The dense, deathly aura penetrated the boundary, which became thinner and thinner until it exploded with a loud bang. The formation light disintegrated, and in an instant, the black mass of undead bodies fell frantically, as if filling up the world. "Now, throw it out," Qin Hao shouted. Sherdong and Bayan poured their energy into the talismans in their hands. They didn't even look at whether the lines on the talismans had been activated. They shouted and threw the talismans directly at the mountain of corpses falling from above. At the same time, inside Qin Hao's divine soul, the Emperor's will radiated outwards. Turbulent Emperor's soul energy stirred up the space, and in an instant, turbulence rose in all directions. Dust and dirt flew into the air, and the disciples were unable to stand steadily. All of them closed their eyes, and their cheeks were slapped by the turbulence. It was as if there were countless flames exploding in all directions, and earth-shattering rumbles resounded one after another. The power of the talismans seemed to be more turbulent than expected. Had Elder Chi's cultivation improved? No one doubted Qin Hao. All the disciples were only grateful to Elder Chi. He was worthy of being an old minister of the Tao sect. The disciples had left home for a long time, yet he still remembered them. In contrast, Shi Jinhua was a disgrace to the Tao sect. He wasn't worthy of being Elder Chi's disciple. The sound of the explosion was deafening. Although it only lasted for a few seconds, the disciples were dumbfounded when they opened their eyes again. With the location where they gathered as the center, everything within a kilometer had been reduced to nothingness. How many undead spirits had those two talismans killed? Moreover, no one saw that amidst the flying dust, the energy of the Grand Tao seemed to descend from the sky, and it descended upon the head of one of the undead battle generals. The undead battle generals, along with the beast bone mount beneath them, were completely obliterated. The undead battle generals that had heavily injured the Martial Pavilion's elder, Bosameo, with a single sword strike had been easily crushed like ants. If someone saw this, they would definitely be scared out of their wits and scream. In short, after the series of explosions stopped, the entire world became peaceful again. In front of the disciples was a magnificent open space. There was no danger, not even half a corpse. Not even a single bone was left behind. Everything had evaporated into thin air. Whoosh! In the distance, the only remaining undead general let out a strange cry from within its armor, as if it had encountered something extremely terrible. The four hooves of the beast bone mount under it galloped wildly. It felt that the Tao sect disciples had all become demons that ate people without spitting out the bones. It was so scared that it disappeared. The undead warriors that it had commanded before were all rolling and crawling to the east and west. The situation was simply too embarrassing. It would have been fine if they were living people, but they were a group of skeletons rolling and crawling. Some of them even broke their legs while running. They didn't have time to pick up their leg bones. Some of the skeletons had their heads separated from their bones and fled in two directions. However, the Tao sect disciples couldn't laugh. The only thing they felt at this moment was shock. "Isn't this too strong?" a disciple said with his eyes wide open. The power of Elder Chi's talismans was beyond imagination. It was like a god descending to the mortal world. In the crowd, Qin Hao's facial muscles twitched unconsciously. It seemed that he had used too much force. After returning to the Emperor's path, it was easy to pretend to be strong, but it was difficult to pretend to be weak. Plop! He fell to the ground. As the undead army dispersed, Bosameo's mind relaxed. Finally, he couldn't hold on and fell to the ground. Third uncle. Bo Minghua's eyes were filled with tears as he watched Bosameo's flesh fester from his arm and spread to the rest of his body. "Leave it to me. It will be fine." Qin Hao came over and said, "Thank you, Third Elder Chu." Bo Minghua hurriedly stepped aside. Although Qin Hao's cultivation wasn't high, he was the alchemist of the herb garden and the only person who could save Bo Sameo's life. Qin Hao's palm flickered with a faint halo as he probed Bo Sameo's condition with his yuan qi. He was injured by the sword qi, but it wasn't very serious. Instead, the death qi spread to his internal organs and his flesh began to decay rapidly. It was a bit troublesome. Of course, other alchemists wouldn't be able to save someone in a short time. But if Dindus saved him, Bo Sameo wouldn't be able to die even if he wanted to. Dilly quietly gathered in his palm, like an invisible black hole that swallowed everything. Qin Hao used his own body as a carrier to forcibly take the death qi from Bo Sameo's body and transfer it to himself. Then, he threw a pill into Bo Sameo's mouth. Third Junior Chu, I no longer doubt Elder Yu's decision. It is my honor to leave the outer sect herb garden to you. Bo Sameo's body lightened as he regained consciousness. With the death qi removed and the pill in his mouth, a powerful vitality nourished his meridians and rotting organs. His bad situation gradually improved. In fact, Qin Hao could have immediately restored Bo Sameo to his original state by using the serene, purifying water spirit. However, if he did that, he would be exposed and Bo Sameo would suspect him. Therefore, it was better to let him recover slowly. I've always been very low-key. Qin Hao smiled and helped Bo Sameo sit up. This elder of the martial pavilion usually didn't like to care about things, but when he encountered a situation, he was the kind of person who would risk his life to protect the overall situation. He was actually very reliable. As for the death qi that was absorbed into his body, Qin Hao couldn't be bothered. The Death Spirit Emperor buried in the cemetery couldn't be compared to him in terms of cultivation. At most, he was a low-level emperor. The power of rules couldn't hurt Qin Hao's body at all. Not to mention that Qin Hao had a demigod body previously. He had also merged with the evil fetus. He himself was an extremely evil existence. How could a mere death qi resist the undying evil power of Shenghua? Almost as soon as the death qi was absorbed into his body, Qin Hao felt it disappear. You rascal! Bo Sameo smiled comfortably. Li Chuji was the same as him. He didn't like to show off. Even if his cultivation was low, he gave people a sense of reliance. He was completely unlike Shi Jinhua, who usually liked to show off and acted as if there was nothing he couldn't do. However, when he was really needed, he abandoned everyone and ran away. This matter wasn't over yet. You rest first. I'll go and check on the disciples. Qin Hao patted Bo Sameo's shoulder. When they were charging with the undead army, many disciples were injured. Well, thank you for your trouble. Bo Sameo nodded and looked at Qin Hao checking on the disciples one by one. He said with appreciation, Junior 3, if you can cultivate to the supreme realm like us, Elder Yu's position will definitely belong to you in the future. This sentence came from the bottom of his heart. Bo Sameo could feel that Qin Hao's alchemy was very refined, and he was very good at refining medicine. He was injured by the undead warrior's sword qi. In the crisis, he didn't have time to check on his own situation, but he could feel that his physical condition was very bad. However, Qin Hao easily resolved it for him. If it were other alchemists, they might not be able to achieve such an effect and speed. Bo Sameo was seriously injured. For a moment, he began to wonder if Qin Hao was an expert who hid his cultivation. Chapter 1658. The undead spirits retreated, giving the Tao sect disciples a chance to catch their breaths. The team rested and checked their injuries. Qin Hao walked among the disciples and offered his condolences one by one. He constantly took out elixirs from his sleeve and gave them simple bandages for minor injuries. Those with more serious injuries took elixirs to adjust their breathing. Soon, the team calmed down. The injuries of the disciples weren't too serious. Many of them only had abrasions and were far from Bo Sameo's level. After all, Yuan venerate undead spirit generals had a high cultivation base and could even use some of the martial techniques they had used when they were alive. Their attacks contained powerful death qi that corroded flesh and blood. Ordinary undead spirits didn't possess such destructive power. Although many disciples were injured, fortunately, no one died. Elder Chu San is much more useful than Shi Jianhua. Bo Minghua watched Qin Hao treat the injuries of his disciples with a serious attitude and a humble tone that made people respect him. Before entering the cemetery, Shi Jianhua had confidently promised that he had enough ability to deal with any danger and could take care of his disciples. In the end, he had run away at the last minute and left the juniors of the sect in a life-or-death situation. He had really taken good care of them. It was extremely shameful to run away without looking back. Elder Chu San's cultivation base was far from Shi Jianhua's. When danger came, he stayed with Bo Minghua and the others, relying on them through thick and thin. The disciples were deeply moved by this. After this trip, the Dao sect disciples realized that one couldn't judge a person by what they said. One had to look at their actions. Elder Chu San and Shi Jianhua's style was simply too distinct. Now is not the time to blame anyone. The most important thing now is to meet up with Elder Shi Qing as soon as possible. Bo Samayo glanced at the lingering haze. This place was too dangerous, and he was very worried about Shi Qing following Shi Jianhua. While the team was resting, Shi Qing finally broke free from Shi Jianhua's grasp in a direction far away from where the battle had broken out. She raised her hand and slapped Shi Jianhua. Slap! The crisp sound of the slap was heard. Shi Qing glared at Shi Jianhua with anger in her eyes. Was abandoning a disciple something an elder could do? Did Shi Jianhua know what shame was? Shi Jianhua lowered his head, not daring to face Xing Qing. After a long while, he finally dared to raise his head and said, "In that situation, I was in a complete mess. My mind was blank and I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could think of was to quickly bring you away from danger. Ah Qing, you should know how important you are to me." Bo Samayo was heavily injured, and his disciples were besieged by the dead spirits. He abandoned everyone and ran away. He did not want to, but he was powerless to reverse the situation. The power of the two undead generals was beyond Bo Samayo's ability to deal with. He was the first to consider Shi Qing's safety. Rather than leaving the entire army to be wiped out, it was better to sacrifice Bo Samayo and his disciples. After all, Shi Jianhua was an elder of the Sword Valley. He couldn't die. Fang Qing ignored Shi Jianhua. She was not a naive little girl who could be fooled by 2 or 3 sweet words. She looked back, and her eyes flashed with great sadness. Then, she continued to walk alone into the center of the cemetery. "Where are you going?" Shi Jianhua exclaimed. "Emperor's tomb." Mei Qing did not even turn her head. "Qing, are you crazy?" Shi Jianhua's heart was beating violently. At this time, he should find a chance to leave the cemetery. Otherwise, wouldn't he have saved Shi Qing for nothing? Using the sacrifice of Samayo, Chu San, and all the disciples to survive. Now that we haven't even seen the Emperor's tomb, do you think you can give up so easily? Shi Qing turned her head and said with a bleak smile, "Shi Jianhua, you don't deserve to be a man. If we can't reach the Emperor's tomb, I'd rather die here." With that, Shi Qing continued to walk deeper into the cemetery. Baiyan, Shi Dong, Shi Lang, and Ming Hua, those children were the future of the Dao sect. They should have had a brilliant life. However, in less than a day, they were like withered flowers. How painful was that? With such a great sacrifice, she should take responsibility. Even if it was for Bo Samayo and the others, she had to go to the Emperor's tomb and bring something back. Otherwise, Shi Qing would not have the face to face her father and 2 uncles. "Qing, don't be unreasonable. Listen to me. I'm the only one who treats you well." "Qing," Shi Jianhua called out loudly, but unfortunately, there was no response. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped forward to catch up. If he went back alone, he would definitely be severely punished by the 3 sect masters. Shi Qing was the daughter of the sect master. If she died, Shi Jianhua would definitely not have an easy time. Moreover, with his strength alone, he did not have the courage to turn back. There were too many dead souls. In short, it was all Ichuji's fault. He was too useless. If it were not for saving him, Bo Samayo would not have been seriously injured. If he had some ability, the disciples would not have been killed by Li Chuji. At the same time that the Dao Sect team was in danger on the east and west sides, Taisui Mountain and Air Striking Sect were also besieged by the Dead Souls. The battle was even more tragic than that of the Dao Sect. Many disciples were injured and died, including many elders. After all, in their team, there was no expert like Qin Hao secretly protecting them. None of the Dao Sect disciples died. However, Taisui Mountain and Air Striking Sect were strong enough. After paying a price, they forced their way out of the encirclement. The remaining people also headed towards the Monarch's tomb. Obviously, they were not frightened. It could be seen that the two sects were indeed much stronger than the Dao Sect. If it were not for Qin Hao secretly protecting them, not many of the Dao Sect disciples would have survived. After a series of setbacks, the three sects continued to push forward. In the blink of an eye, many days had passed. In the cemetery, the battle was always going on. Rotting corpses would suddenly appear from time to time and stab the disciples of the three sections. Moreover, they did not know whose feet they would come from. It was impossible to guard against them. Along the way, the number of people from Taisui Mountain and Air Striking Sect decreased. As for Qin Hao and the others, they lost their direction. The cemetery was shrouded in fog. They could not see where they were at all. Fortunately, Qin Hao had enough medicinal pills to replenish the vitality and physical strength of the disciples. In terms of condition, the Dao Sect was far better than the other two sections. They maintained a 0 death rate. "Si Qing, where are you?" Bosameo looked at the boundless cemetery and sighed. These days, his injuries had improved a lot. It was all thanks to Qin Hao's treatment. Although he had not recovered to his peak state, he was 70 to 80% better. He could once again bear the heavy responsibility of protecting the disciples. Furthermore, Qin Hao had played an extremely important role in the team. Even Bosameo had never thought that the owner of the Dao Sect's herb garden would actually have so many medicinal pills. There were pills of all types, and they were very plentiful. The disciples couldn't finish them all, and the team's overall combat strength was almost unaffected. Unknowingly, this alchemist with a low cultivation base who wasn't liked by many had risen in the hearts of the disciples. At the very least, everyone now had to respectfully call him elderly. Bosameo thought that this was excellent. However, because of this, he was even more worried about Si Qing's situation. She did not have any medicinal pills with her. If she encountered danger again, she might become Shi Jinhua's sacrifice. Now, that Sword Valley elder had no credibility in the hearts of the disciples. Being dragged down by Shi Jinhua, Shi Lang could not raise his head anymore. Chapter 1659. Third day, did we go the wrong way? Should we change our route? Bosameo asked. The tombs under his feet were endless, and the fog blocked his vision. He couldn't tell north from south. He was worried that the team would go in circles. The route should be right. Let's continue forward. Qin Hao pointed behind Bosameo. There was a medicine bottle that he dropped. He made marks along the way, but there were no marks in front. This proved that the team was continuing to go in the right direction. Thank you. Bosameo nodded. Qin Hao was not only steady, but he was also very meticulous. After a few more days, everyone finally arrived at the central area. In this area, the aura of death was extremely strong, far stronger than before. The oppressive feeling in the fog was even stronger. It involuntarily made people feel awe, as if this place was inviolable. Everyone felt the same. The tomb must be nearby. This was the intuition of a martial artist. Strangely enough, the closer they got to the central area, the calmer it became. The undead spirits that pestered them along the way completely disappeared. The team almost didn't encounter any more obstacles. Everyone felt strange, but they couldn't find a reason. They could only strengthen their vigilance. In this regard, Qin Hao wasn't worried. He knew that Emperor Yuan, who was buried here, didn't have a high cultivation level when he was alive. Judging from various signs, he was good at controlling corpses. He was a bit like a puppet master. Therefore, he didn't have enough ability to control a large number of Renhuangs. After all, Ren Huangs had undergone the second transformation and had begun to feel the existence of Tao. Their divine souls were very powerful, and it wasn't easy to control Ren Huangs. What's more, how much of Emperor Yuan's power could he retain? This could explain why Ren Huangs from the outside world couldn't enter the cemetery. Only those with low cultivation levels could, because there were no Emperor-level undead spirits guarding the central area. It seemed that the dead Emperor Yuan was planning something. But in any case, Qin Hao wasn't afraid of him. As they continued forward, the oppressive feeling became stronger and stronger. There was a faint roar in the space, giving people a sense of awe. Soon, everyone saw the goal of this trip. The tomb. In front of them, an imperial tomb towered like a mountain. It was incomparably huge. In a cemetery full of small mounds, it looked particularly tall and straight. The moment the disciples saw this, their hearts were filled with endless chilliness. This emperor's tomb's appearance was sinister and terrifying. It was forcefully opened up by someone, and an enormous hole appeared. A horrifying and strange sound rang out from the hole, making everyone's blood run cold. Looks like someone got here before us. Bo Sameo was a little excited. How could the mausoleum of Emperor Yuan not be exciting? He wondered if the person who broke through the mausoleum was from the Tai Sui Mountain or the Striking Void sect, or if both sects had already entered. I'm a little scared. The Achilles heel of a martial emperor must be terrifying. Could there be an even more powerful undead guardian? The legs of the disciples of Taoism began to tremble. The huge hole in front of them was like a devouring mouth. Once they walked in, no one could guarantee that they would come out alive. Although Emperor Yuan was dead, his might was still there. Even if it's a dragon's lair or a tiger's den, I still have to go. Bo Sameo gritted his teeth and led the way towards the hole. If Qin Hao's analysis was correct, as long as Shi Qing was still alive, she would definitely enter deep into the Emperor's tomb. Perhaps she had already made a move against the two sections. Now was the time when she needed help. After entering the Emperor tomb, it was dark and damp. Cold winds swept through the stone cracks, releasing a few sharp sounds. Because someone had passed through before, there was nothing to worry about. Everyone sped up and soon arrived at the interior. As a grotto heaven world appeared in front of them, their vision suddenly opened up. Many figures came into view. Bo Sameo was surprised to find that Shi Qing was indeed here. Of course, it wasn't just her. Shi Jinhua and the people of the two sects were also here. At this moment, the three parties were in a confrontation. Shi Qing and Shi Jinhua's auras were unstable. It was obvious that they had fought with someone, but they weren't injured. In front of them, there were 4 men and women standing. Their bodies were filled with vitality. The Striking Void sect and Tai Sui Mountain each had 2 elders. There were also a few disciples of the two sects who were left behind. They were all injured and weak disciples. Qin Hao's spiritual power radiated out. With a thought, it enveloped the entire tomb, probing the situation in every corner. He found that inside the tomb, figures could be seen scurrying around like a group of rats. Elder Song of the Tai Sui Mountain, Elder Wu of the Striking Void sect, Lu Guang, and Dui Tianchong were frantically searching for treasures. They had already found a lot of good stuff. Of course, there were still many people searching for treasures, but there wasn't anyone from the Dao sections. It was obvious that Shi Qing and Shi Jinhua were blocked here. The Striking Void sect and Tai Sui Mountain had left some people behind to prevent them from entering. The two sects wanted to divide the treasures of the Emperor's tomb. However, as Qin Hao and the rest arrived, this suppression was instantly broken. The 4 elders of the Tai Sui Mountain and Striking Void sect looked at the Dao sect's team in shock. They had actually preserved so many people. It was almost the same number as before they entered the tomb. This made the elders of the two sects feel incredulous. They had already experienced how dangerous the tomb was. Even though they had rushed here, they had paid a great price. Almost 40% of their disciples had died, but the Dao sect's battle strength was intact. Sameo, 3rd year. Shi Qing walked over quickly. Her eyes were wet as she looked at the neat formation of disciples, Xuan Xiu, Shi Dong, and Bo Minghua. Not a single one was missing. She was the most surprised person. You guys are actually fine? Sure, Jinhua was also surprised. You were hoping something would happen to us. Bosameo said coldly. Don't misunderstand. I'm happy. After the shock, Sure Jinhua immediately felt guilty. He also pretended to be excited and walked forward. He looked at the disciples with a gratified expression. He patted their shoulders and touched their heads. He almost shed tears and said, I knew that you guys would be safe. After all, you are the elites of our Dao sections. With Elder Bo leading you guys, you could defeat the Dao sect's disciples without any difficulty. Take your hand away. A disciple pushed away Sure Jinhua's hand in disdain. This hypocrite was disgusting. Nonsense. Sure Jinhua put his hands behind his back as if he was angry. But he wasn't really angry. He casually glanced at Qin Hao and then directly ignored him. He said to Bo Sameo, Sameo, you didn't disappoint me. You brought the disciples back safely. To be honest, I was very worried about you guys. The second I left, my heart ached. I felt guilty, self-reproach, extremely worried, and really sad. But you have to understand me. After all, it was too dangerous. Sure Jinhua said a long speech. There wasn't the slightest hint of regret in his words. It was as stiff as a recitation. But the more he spoke, the more moved he was. In the end, he couldn't help but cry. Of course, he was only moved by himself. No one in the Dao sects was moved. Instead, the more they listened, the more disgusted they felt. Siqing, I still have some energy-nurturing pills left. Take them first. Qin Hao handed the pills to Shi Qing. Shi Qing's condition wasn't too good. She urgently needed to recover. Suddenly, the elders of the Taisui Mountain and the Void-Striking sect saw the pills in Qin Hao's hand. Greed flashed in their eyes. Their condition wasn't much better than Shi Qing's. After days of fierce battles and endless attacks from the dead spirits, their bodies and spirits were exhausted. But unfortunately, they had already used up their pills. Thank you, Chu-san. Shi Qing was very grateful. Naturally, she wouldn't refuse. Qin Hao was the alchemist of the Dao sections. Moreover, she could see that Qin Hao had been watching over the disciples all the way here safely. You have pills? Shi Jinhua's eyes lit up. He was about to ask Qin Hao for some pills. Unfortunately, there's none left. Qin Hao directly took out an empty bottle and poured the pills out. Not a single pill was left. Shi Jinhua's facial features suddenly twisted. He frowned. What was the meaning of this? As the alchemist of the Dao sects, Li Chuji must carry a lot of pills with him. Shi Qing was the daughter of the sect leader. Her status was noble. She had pills to eat. How could Shi Jinhua not have any? You did it on purpose? Shi Jinhua's face was cold. Qin Hao glanced at Shi Jinhua indifferently. He casually threw the pill bottle on the ground. He was too lazy to explain. Li, Chu, San. Shi Jinhua suddenly stretched out his hand and grabbed Qin Hao's collar. What did he mean by throwing the pill bottle on the ground? Was he humiliating him? Chapter 1660. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Emperor Yuan's coffin. Shi Jinhua. Let go. The disciples have consumed a lot of energy along the way, and the pills are limited. Chusen won't lie, Bosameo said sternly. He believed in Qin Hao's character. You may believe it, but I don't. You have pills to replenish your energy along the way, but why are they suddenly gone when you reach me? Hand over your storage ring. I want to check it. Shi Jinhua tried his best to raise his palm, but he was not as tall as Qin Hao. His thin body was unexpectedly heavy, and even if he used both hands, it was useless. Boom! A beam of fire flew and shot towards Shi Jinhua's cheek. He hurriedly dodged to the side. The fire brushed past his face and hit the ground. At this moment, his palm let go of Qin Hao, and he looked in a certain direction. The person who attacked was none other than Bien. You? Shi Jinhua frowned. A disciple attacking an elder. Was this a rebellion? Have some shame. Unknowingly, Bien stood in front of Qin Hao. Not only him, but the other disciples also took a step forward and protected Qin Hao behind them like a human wall. Pairs of cold eyes stared at Sir Genoa of the Sword Valley. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the field changed subtly. The master of the herb garden, who had always been disliked by the disciples, actually received absolute support. You all. Sir Genoa was very surprised and couldn't react in time. Looking at the disciples and the protected Qin Hao, they had united as one. Qin Hao had become the will of the disciples of the Dao sects. If he attacked again, he would be going against the Dao sects. Phew! Sure Qing let out a long breath. She didn't feel that there was anything wrong. On the contrary, she felt very relieved and said, Sameo, Chu-san, bring Bien and the others in. The elders of the two sects shouldn't have any objections, right? After saying that, Sure Qing stared at the four middle-aged men and women from the Void Strike sect and the Tai Sui Mountain. Cough, cough. Since it is agreed that the disciples will explore the tomb, we naturally have no objections. However, I hope that you can still make it in time after you chase after them, an elder of the Tai Sui Mountain said sarcastically. In order to stop Sure Qing and Sure Jinhua from entering the tomb, the Dao sects had decided that only disciples could enter. Now that the Dao sect's way, they couldn't embarrass themselves by not letting the Dao sect's disciples. Moreover, even if he could block it, he probably wouldn't be able to. Siqing, you and Chu-san lead the disciples in. I will stay here. Bo Sameo said. He had not fully recovered from his injuries, and in comparison, Sure Qing was more suitable to lead the team. After he finished speaking, he did not forget to glance at Sure Jinhua and said, You stay as well. Sure Jinhua's lips trembled. He wanted to speak, but he discovered that he was gradually losing the ability to convince others. Even if he wanted to replace Qin Hao and be together with Shang Qing, he feared that the disciples wouldn't agree to this request. He was isolated. Disciples below high level will stay behind. The rest, follow me. Bian looked at Siqing. Aunt, on the third day of the Lunar New Year, let's go, Qing said. Yes. Qin Hao nodded. The group passed through the blockade of Tai Sui Mountain and Air Striking Sect, and soon disappeared into the darkness of the tomb. The reason why Bo Sameo was left here was because he was injured. Moreover, the Void Striking Sect and the Tai Sui Mountain were not fools. There might be danger in the depths of the tomb, so they left some people to guard it in case of any accidents. The Dao sect naturally had to leave some people behind as well. They could not leave their backs to others at any time. The tomb was very big, and there were many passages inside. The group advanced along the passages, and along the way, they discovered many caves. There were many skeletons lying in the caves, both human and beast. Judging from the traces, the skeletons in the caves had fought before they died. There were many rusty weapons on the ground, and there were also some storage rings left behind. However, when the Dao sect disciples picked up the rings, they discovered that they were empty. It was most likely that the Void Striking Sect and Tai Sui Mountain disciples had transferred them to their pockets. The spatial spiritual formation has lost its effect, and these rings are useless. Shirlang threw the rings back as if he was throwing away trash. His face was full of disdain. The other disciples were also somewhat disappointed. It was not easy for them to break through the tomb and reach the Emperor's cave, but the treasures were actually taken away by the other two sections. Third day. It seems like we have to split up temporarily. You lead Sherdong, Qing, and the rest. Bian, Shirlang, you guys lead some people. The rest of the disciples follow me. It will be easier for us to search if we spread out. Remember, the group should not be too far apart. If you encounter something you can't handle, gather immediately. Seize the time to find something useful. Don't go too far. Even if you can't find anything, it's fine as long as you are safe. Okay. Qin Hao thought that Shi Qing's consideration was correct. He called Shi Dong and Qing and led 7 or 8 disciples to another tunnel. Bian, Shi Lang, and the rest did the same. They split into 3 groups and expanded the search area. There were many tunnels in the Emperor's tomb, and each one was very large. The deeper they went, the colder it felt. It was not an ordinary coldness, but a coldness that stimulated the soul. It was as if the end of each tunnel led to hell. It made one's heart palpitate involuntarily. Along the way, Qin Hao led Sherdong and found many things. Maybe the void-striking sect and Tai Sui Mountain did not have the time to search through the path they took. In the rings they found on the skeletons, there were many things that belonged to the owner when he was alive. There were weapons, techniques, and treasures. Some of them were even upper-grade venerable weapons. It could be said that the harvest was not small. Of course, Qin Hao naturally did not pay attention to it. To him, everything was trash, but in the eyes of the disciples, it was different. They had cultivated for more than 20 years and stepped into the saint realm. Their martial path still had a long way to go. They were quite excited to find venerable weapons. Listening to Shi Qing's tone, she doesn't want to find the emperor's coffin anymore. Qin Hao muttered to himself. Perhaps what happened before had a great impact on Shi Qing. Compared to finding treasures, she cared more about the safety of her disciples. In the emperor's tomb, the most valuable thing was, of course, Emperor Yuan's coffin. If they found the emperor's coffin, there was a great possibility of obtaining the inheritance of an emperor-level powerhouse. It was of great significance to the revitalization of the sect. However, Shi Qing seemed to have given up. Qin Hao chuckled. If there was a chance, he would like to find the emperor's coffin and open it to see the owner of the emperor's tomb. A puppet master who entered the emperor realm through the path of undead had aroused his interest. However, it did not matter. The undead inheritance was of no use to Qin Hao. In contrast, he felt that he should tap into the power of the evil fetus in his body and master the rules of evil spirits of Shanghua. The battle in the Divine Palace was still fresh in his memory. Master, there's movement. There was a collision sound in front of them, and there was a faint shout. Sherdong said, "Let's go and take a look." Qin Hao also heard it. It seemed to be the sound of Baiyan. Following the direction of the source of the sound, the group sped up and soon arrived at the location. It was indeed Baiyan. "Li Chuji, don't come over," Baiyan shouted anxiously. He saw it. At this moment, in front of Baiyan and Shi Lang, a group of warriors stood. The person in the lead was Lu Guang. They were stopped by Lu Guang. "Since you're here, let's go together." A cold voice sounded and appeared behind Qin Hao. Qin Hao turned his head and found that Elder Wu of the Strikong sect had blocked their escape route. "Didn't I tell you not to come over?" Baiyan said angrily. There were many branches in the corridor. He and Shi Lang searched here and were unexpectedly trapped by the disciples of the Strikong sect, led by Lu Guang. Obviously, they were up to no good. Li Chuji's character was not bad, but as Shi Jinhua said, his cultivation was too low. Once he fought with others, he could not exert any combat effectiveness. Qin Hao smiled lightly. He could see that although Baiyan had a fiery temper, he was actually not a bad person. When he said don't come over, he was actually worried about them. "So it's Elder Wu. There are many treasures in the Emperor's tomb. You guys are not looking for treasures, but are trapping my sect's disciples. What's the meaning of this?" Qin Hao asked calmly. He was not worried at all. "Elderly, there are too many treasures in the Emperor's tomb. It's not good for my Strikong sect to monopolize them. The three sects should share them equally. Truth be told, I found a good place in the tomb. Why don't we go together?" Elder Wu knew that Qin Hao was an alchemist in the medicinal garden. His cultivation base was low and he was not a threat. "If I say no, will we be in trouble?" Qin Hao showed a trace of nervousness. Found a good place and divided the treasures equally? Even Shi Jinhua would not believe such nonsense. There must be something fishy going on. However, when he saw Elder Wu's face turn gloomy, Qin Hao hurriedly changed his words. "I'm just joking. Actually, I have the same intention. It's an honor for my sect to be able to join forces with the Strikong sect. Only in this way can we obtain greater opportunities." "Li Chuji, are you confused?" Baiyan scolded loudly. "Shut up. I'm an elder," Qin Hao roared. He put on the airs of an elder and established his prestige. Elderly is a person with good foresight. If you cooperate with me, you will benefit a lot. Dao sect will not lose out." Elder Wu glanced at Baiyan indifferently. His eyes were extremely sharp. Although most of his power was suppressed by the tomb, if he wanted to kill a Dao sect disciple, it would be a piece of cake. Then I'll rely on Elder Wu. Qin Hao thanked him and secretly sent a look to Bian. Although Bian was very dissatisfied, he also knew that it was not good to fall out with Elder Wu. Let's go. Let me bring you to that wonderful place. Elder Wu took the first step and led the way for everyone. Lu Guang and the Strike Kong sect's disciples suppressed the rear with an unfriendly expression, cutting off the chance for the Dao sect's people to escape. In desperation, the two sects merged into one force and continued to move towards the depths of the Emperor's cave. You believe his nonsense? Bian transmitted his voice to Qin Hao as he walked. You see the situation. If we don't do as he says, we will be killed immediately. But don't be afraid. With me here, no one will be in danger. Qin Hao guaranteed. Bian curled his lips and did not say anything. With Li Chuji here, no one will be in danger? Shi Jinhua said the same thing before. What was the result? It turned out that Li Chuji and Shi Jinhua were the same. They loved to boast. The group moved forward and met the people from Taisui Mountain. Surprisingly, Shi Qing was also there. The second she saw Qin Hao, she was stunned. Then, she smiled bitterly. It seemed that Qin Hao was also threatened by Elder Wu. She was also stopped by Elder Song and Elder Dui. If she did not cooperate, the other party might kill her. Shi Qing was naturally not afraid. For the sake of her disciples, she could only compromise. However, she did not know where Wu and Song would take them. A very bad premonition arose in her heart. Chapter 1661. The disciples of the three sects formed a team. Elder Song and Elder Wu were at the front, while Lu Guang and Dui Tan were at the back. The people of Taoism were in the middle, as if they were escorting prisoners. Elder Song from Taisui Mountain held a compass in his hand. As they moved forward, the compass needle kept spinning, sometimes pointing to the left and sometimes to the right, as if it was guiding them in some direction. The compass was a sacred object of Taisui Mountain. It was very sensitive to the spiritual energy emitted by treasures. As long as they followed the direction of the compass, they would be able to find the treasure accurately. Along the way, Elder Song and Elder Wu kept talking. Elder Wu nodded frequently. The two sects had apparently formed some kind of tacit understanding. As for what they were talking about, they did not tell Qin Hao and Shi Qing. The Emperor's coffin should be in front. At this time, Elder Song said excitedly. The compass in his hand shone with a strong halo, and he could sense the rich aura of treasures nearby. Elder Shi Qing, Elder Li, please lead the elites of Taoism to lead the way for us. Elder Wu's voice was extremely cold. He and Elder Song stepped back tacitly. For a moment, the position of the disciples of Taoism was at the forefront. We don't know where you're going. Why do you want us to lead the way? Swan and I protested. The Emperor's tomb was dangerous. Were they using them to lead the way? Shut your mouth obediently. The Tao sect will follow my master's instructions. Lu Guang ordered. Swan and I suppressed the anger in his heart. Taisui Mountain and Voidstrike sect were colluding and driving them to openly bully Taoism. The other disciples were also very angry. However, they were completely helpless in the current situation. To put it bluntly, it was Taoism's fault for being weak. If the sect was strong enough and the Taoist ancestor was still alive, how could Taisui Mountain and Voidstrike sect dare to be so presumptuous? Shi Qing's expression was very bad. She clenched her fists, and there was a murderous intent between her brows. In just a moment, the murderous intent disappeared, and she weakly loosened her fists. She understood that she did not fulfill her responsibility to take care of the disciples. It was her negligence to put the juniors in unknown danger. I'll lead the way. Qin Hao spoke out. He took the lead and walked forward alone. Even if the path ahead was filled with darkness, he was willing to be the light that opened up the darkness. Elder Chu San. Many disciples watched on, their hearts trembling. Was Li Chuji this fearless? He was only an alchemist in charge of the outer court's herb garden. He wasn't good at fighting, and his cultivation was only at the profound sage realm. In fact, his cultivation was even lower than that of many disciples. Bian, Shilang, and Bo Minghua were all stronger than Qin Hao. Even the two disciples he had personally taught were not much weaker than him. Even so, while everyone was panicking, he still turned into a rock and was willing to fill the unknown pit. This grace and courage moved the disciples, but also made them feel ashamed. Thinking back to the past, during the 8 years of Taoism, who had sincerely respected a little alchemist like him? Only Sherdong and Yin Qingqing stayed by his side like idiots. From now on, all of you should be more respectful to Li Chuji. Otherwise, you will become my enemy. Tao Wu scanned the disciples of Taoism and felt his blood boiling. Even he was not as courageous as them. If he could survive, if he could leave safely, perhaps he should apologize to Li Chu-san. You have to call my master elder. Sherdong stepped forward and followed closely behind Qin Hao with Yin Qingqing. Although their master always did some inexplicable things that they couldn't understand, those seemingly unreliable things were very effective in the end. Sherdong and Yin Qingqing didn't understand, but there was one thing that they absolutely trusted Qin Hao. The team continued to move forward. With Qin Hao at the front, although the disciples of Taoism were still panicking, they were more at ease. At least, Li Chuji would be the first to fall into danger. Qing followed beside Qin Hao. The two walked side by side. Since the other party could be so reckless, as the daughter of the master, she couldn't let Qin Hao face it alone. All this fell into the eyes of the disciples of Tai Sui Mountain and Void-Striking Sect. Except for sympathy, they didn't feel that it was inappropriate. They couldn't let them explore the way, right? As they went deeper into the passageway, the corpse chi in the air became more and more intense. The Emperor's Cave was like a 10,000-year-old rotting corpse field. The smell was unbearable. Finally, under the guidance of Elder Song of Tai Sui Mountain, the three sects arrived at the end of the passageway. At the end of the passageway was a thick and heavy stone door. It was dozens of feet tall and majestic. It revealed endless desolation and loneliness, as if it was connected to another world. No one knew what was inside. However, the moment they saw the stone door, everyone's heart tightened. The door was covered with bloody palm prints. From the outside, it looked like it was slapped from the inside and imprinted on the door. The entire giant door was uneven and looked extremely terrifying. The disciples of the three sects seemed to be hallucinating. In a blur, they saw the bloody palm prints that covered the stone door seem to be moving. There seemed to be countless people wailing, screaming, struggling, and longing to escape from the door. However, the gate had sealed everyone inside, imprisoning them. Go and open it, Elder Song said, his voice trembling slightly. This door gave him a strong sense of crisis, but the compass in his hand shone brightly, clearly telling him that there was a treasure hidden inside. We have already brought the place. Everything here has nothing to do with the Tao sects. You want the treasure, but we don't want it either. Please open the door. Third day, let's go. Qing didn't do as Elder Song said. She had a hunch that behind the door might be the Emperor's coffin, Emperor Yuan's mausoleum. No one in the world wouldn't be tempted by treasures. Qing naturally wanted to obtain Emperor Yuan's relics, but she knew that life was precious. She couldn't allow her disciples to face danger a second time. It's not up to you. Open it. Elder Wu's face was extremely gloomy. Purple vitality flickered around his body, and his ruthless eyes threatened the disciples of the Tao sects. If anyone dared to take half a step back, he wouldn't show mercy. Elder Wu, what you did today, aren't you afraid that my father and two uncles will kill their way to the Strike Kong sect? Qing also released her vitality. Her hair danced in the wind. She wouldn't give in anymore. The three sovereigns of the Tao sects are powerful, so I naturally respect them. But with the Tao sovereign guarding the Strike Kong sect, it won't be easy for Sect Master Shi to break in and take my head. Elder Wu said fearlessly. Elder Qing, don't make things difficult for us. Elder Song's eyes were cold. In the Tai Sui Mountain team, there was another elder here besides him. If they really fought, Qing would have to fight 1 against 3. As for Li Chuji of the Tao sects, his combat power was limited, and he was directly ignored by Elder Song. You all are going too far. I, Shi Qing, will remember this. Shi Qing's gaze swept across Elder Wu and the other two. She had no chance of winning if she fought with them. She turned around and angrily slammed her palm on the bloody stone door. Vitality gushed out, and with a rumble, dust fell. The entire tomb was shaking, and the two stone doors slowly opened. In an instant, a suffocating cold aura gushed out crazily from behind the door, accompanied by a strange, ear-piercing scream. Everyone felt as if they had fallen into the abyss of hell, and they couldn't help but shiver. Go in. Elder Wu became even more excited, and his voice trembled even more. It was definitely the Emperor's coffin. The Emperor's coffin must be inside. I'll go in first. Within Qin Hao's body, the vast dilly was quietly circulating. Through his clothes, a strong platinum luster could be seen flowing. Of course, he wasn't afraid of the guy lying in the Emperor's coffin, but he wanted to prevent the disciples behind him from suffering any mishaps. Emperor Yuan had mastered the Dao laws. Even if he was dead, his power was still very terrifying. It wasn't something that the weak disciples could withstand. Junior Chu, be careful. Seeing Qin Hao step into the tomb, Shi Qing hurriedly followed. All the disciples of the Dao sects followed. No matter what was inside, they could only rely on the elders of the sect. Apart from Lu Guang and Dui Tianchong, there were naturally other geniuses from the Strike Sky sect and Tai Sui Mountain. However, the two of them were extremely talented, and the brilliance of the others was suppressed. Even so, it didn't mean that they were weak. On the contrary, they were very strong. At the very least, they weren't inferior to Shi Dong, Shi Lang, and Bo Minghua. Chapter 1663. At this moment, the person who was blocking Swan Yi's path was Lin Chong, a supreme genius of the Void Striking faction. Lin Chong was the eldest senior brother of the inner sect and the direct disciple of the Dao Emperor. He had always been the leader of the younger generation in the sect, but because Lu Guang had surpassed him, he had been relegated to second place. In terms of seniority, Lin Chong was still higher than Lu Guang, which showed how outstanding he was. Retreat or die. Lin Chong's eyes were cold, and his body was full of saintly power. A golden halo floated beside him, which was his soul. Swan Yi's expression was solemn. He naturally knew Lin Chong. As his name suggested, he was very talented and experienced in battle. He had defeated the direct disciple of the Dao Emperor. However, it was impossible for him to retreat with just one sentence from Lin Chong. At this moment, the Qilin phantom roared, and the bloodline in Swan Yi's body continued to rise. Huh! Lin Chong snorted coldly and said no more. His soul flickered with a sharp light like a dazzling blade. Driven by his saintly power, the halo suddenly flew toward Swan Yi, intending to kill him. Clang! A figure descended from the sky. Shi Dong swung his sword, and as the sword light fell, the halo was shaken and flew to the side. Shi Dong felt his arms go numb, and he took several steps back. He said to Swan Yi, "Why aren't you chasing him? Be careful of this person." Swan Yi reminded. The sacred beast phantom continued to run, directly passing Lin Chong and chasing after Lu Guang. The distance between the two kept shrinking. Lin Chong looked back indifferently and didn't stop him. There were many disciples of the Dao sect, and he couldn't stop all of them. He had done his duty by suppressing Shi Dong. As for the coffin, Lu Guang would deal with it. It's your misfortune to pick me as your opponent. Lin Chong looked forward. This disciple of the Dao sect was at the 4th level of the profound saint realm. Not to mention the power of his bloodline. Just his cultivation alone was 2 levels lower than him. He was doomed to be defeated. Be careful that you don't get slapped in the face when you talk big. Shi Dong rushed forward, and the sharp sword in his hand trembled. He stabbed out a dazzling sword shadow, and his moves were unpredictable. It was difficult to distinguish the real from the fake, and it completely enveloped Lin Chong. Fancy. Lin Chong's face was filled with disdain as he pointed his finger forward. Instantly, a whistling sound could be heard behind him as the wheel light that had been sent flying flew in an arc and suddenly flew over. The light was incomparably bright, and as it expanded, it transformed into a light shield that blocked all of the sword shadows, causing a series of sparks to explode. This fellow is quite difficult to deal with. I have to use my ultimate move. Using the water wind steps, he dodged the wheel light slashes again and again, always maintaining a certain distance. However, in this process, he was getting closer and closer to Lin Chong. Finally, he had a chance to get close to him. Bang! Sherdong roared and let go of his sword. He threw it behind him and took a heavy step forward. The moment he threw his sword, his right palm immediately clenched into a fist. His blood roared, and his physical strength exploded. Saint power poured into his right arm, and his fist burst out with a raging fist aura. Damn it! Lin Chong could not dodge. Sherdong's body movement technique was too fast. The fist was right in front of him. He had no choice but to meet the fist with his own. He also poured out his holy power and punched out. Bang! The two fists collided. The sound of flesh colliding was heavy and intense. Both of them sank down at the same time. The ground sank half a foot deep, and two ripple-like cracks spread out. However, Sherdong suddenly felt that Lin Chong's fist was incomparably hard. The power behind the punch was not weak. Perhaps it was not as strong as Sherdong's, but at least it was enough to block him. Hee. You think I can't see through your intentions? Don't think I'm just an arcane master who only cultivates Yuan Qi. Do you know the air-striking divine fist of the air-striking sect? Lin Chong's Yuan Qi quickly flowed to his arm. A bright orange halo burst out under his fist. With a buzzing sound, Sherdong only felt his ears go deaf and his head become dizzy. At this time, an explosive force rushed into his body through his arm. It was incomparably fierce. Qila. The clothes on Sherdong's back exploded, forming the shape of a fist. A wave of fist aura penetrated his body. Lin Chong laughed. Comparing techniques? This Taoist disciple was too inexperienced. So you deliberately confused me. Master was right. The end of arrogant people is often death by their arrogance. Sherdong raised his head, his eyes filled with cunning. What? Lin Chong was shocked to find that Sherdong, who was hit by his air-striking divine fist, actually withstood it. How is this possible? Not to mention that Sherdong's cultivation level was lower than his by 2 levels. Even if they were on the same level, Lin Chong had enough confidence to heavily injure his opponent with 1 punch. Even if he could not kill his opponent, he would not be in such a state like Sherdong. It was as if Sherdong's body directly neutralized the power of his punch. What kind of physical strength was this? A monster? The unparalleled Tang, Sekfo Lin Chong naturally did not know that Sherdong, who was under Qin Hao, was being tempered by Dinda's medicinal baths every day. The medicinal power of Qin Hao's medicine was incomparably tyrannical. It madly stimulated Sherdong's flesh and blood. It was simply a torture. Because he could not bear it at first, he fainted several times. If he had not seen Shi Lang being suppressed in one move, Dui Tianchong would have even wondered if there was something wrong with his Tai Sui stellar energy. However, reality proved that there was nothing wrong with his stellar energy. Why could it not hurt Yin Qingqing? At this moment, Dui Tianchong's gaze fell on the medicinal pestle in the crazy woman's hand. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.